The morning Henry Blackstone died, Eleanor Price was already on her feet before sunrise, the way she had been every morning for 30 years. She had not slept. Not truly. She had lain on the narrow iron bed in the housekeeper's room at the far east end of the house, listening to the sound of the doctor moving down the hall, the soft closing of doors, the particular hush that settles over a household when everyone inside it knows what is coming. At 3 in the morning, she had risen and dressed in the dark, pulling on her gray wool dress by touch, pinning her hair without a mirror. Then she had gone down to the kitchen and built the fire and put the kettle on because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands when she heard the bell from Henry's room, 2 short pulls the signal she had taught the night nurse 2 weeks ago. She set the cup down without drinking from it and walked upstairs. He was still breathing when she came in. Barely. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed with his bag already clasped shut, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about what kind of breathing it was. The night nurse sat in the corner chair with her hands folded. The room smelled of camphor and old wood and the particular staleness of a sick room in winter. Eleanor went to the bedside and took Henry Blackstone's hand. His fingers were cool and papery, and he did not close them around hers, but she felt the faint shift of them, a pressure so slight it might have been imagination, and she stayed. She stayed until the breathing stopped, and then she stayed a few minutes longer because 30 years of service earns you that much at the very least. The doctor noted the time, 4:17 in the morning, February 9th, 1894. By 5 o'clock, Eleanor had telegraphed Samuel Finch, the family attorney, and the 3 Blackstone children, Richard and Billings Caroline, in Helena and Luke at his ranch 20 miles south. By 6, she had arranged for the undertaker. By 7, she had woken the ranch cook, Mrs. Aldridge, and the 2 housemaids, Pearl and Dolores, and given them their instructions for the day. By 8, she had pressed Henry's good black suit, the one he'd worn to church twice a year since Eleanor could remember, and laid it out for the undertaker, who arrived at 8:30 and was gone within the hour. Then she went back to the kitchen and stood at the window again and drank the rest of her cold coffee, and she did not let herself feel anything beyond a distant and manageable sorrow, the kind she had long practiced with. Gatta. The snow came in hard from the north the night before the funeral, which Eleanor privately thought was fitting. Montana in February did not concern itself with the convenience of the grieving. The roads to Blackstone Ranch became treacherous enough that several neighboring families who had planned to attend the service in town instead sent their ranch hands ahead with flowers and their regrets. And the flowers arrived so frozen that Eleanor had to stand them in buckets of warm water in the kitchen for 2 hours before they could be arranged properly. Richard arrived the day before the funeral in a hired coach from Billings, his wife Constance beside him and their 3 children stuffed in behind them like livestock in a pen. He was a broad man, going to fat Richard Blackstone with his father's square jaw and none of his father's reserve. He came through the front door, already talking, his overcoat still on, and went directly to the study without acknowledging Eleanor standing in the hallway, which was exactly what she had expected. "I'll want an accounting of the household accounts first thing in the morning," he told her as he passed, as though she had asked him something. "And make sure the whiskey decanter is full, the good whiskey." "Yes, Mr. Blackstone," she said. He did not say thank you for the telegram or thank you for seeing to the arrangements or anything at all. She had not expected him to. Caroline came in on the afternoon train alone. She was 45 and handsome in the severe way of women who have spent their lives being considered capable rather than charming. She had married twice and buried one husband and left the other, and she wore her independence the way some women wore jewelry, deliberately so it could not be missed. She stopped in the hallway and looked at Eleanor with an expression Eleanor had long since catalogued as the particular variety of Blackstone calculation that disguised itself as concern. "You look tired, Mrs. Price," Caroline said. "I'm well, thank you, Miss Blackstone. I imagine it's been difficult, all of this." A pause precisely long enough to carry meaning without committing to it. "Managing the house during Father's final days. You've done it well." "It was my duty," Eleanor said. Caroline looked at her a moment longer, then nodded as though Eleanor had answered a different question than the one she'd asked, and went upstairs to the bedroom that had been kept ready for her. Luke arrived the morning of the funeral. Eleanor was in the parlor adjusting a spray of pine branches on the mantelpiece. When she heard his horse in the yard, she knew the sound of that particular horse, a big gray gelding Luke had been riding since before he'd gone to the cavalry, and she heard him stop to speak to Clem Dawson, the head wrangler, before coming inside. The 2 men talked for 10 minutes in the cold, which told Eleanor that Luke Blackstone had stopped at the bunkhouse first and spoken to the ranch hands before coming to the house, which was not what Richard had done, nor Caroline. She noted it the way she noted everything on this ranch, quietly without comment for her own reckoning. He came in through the kitchen door, which was also not what Richard had done. He was tracking snow, and he knew it. She could see him checking his boots before he stepped fully onto the kitchen floor, and he pulled his hat off when he came in, which Richard had not done either. "Mrs. Price," he said. "Mr. Blackstone, I'm sorry for your loss." He was 42 years old, and he looked it, which Eleanor found she respected. There were men who tried to look younger, and men who tried to look harder, and Luke Blackstone had always just looked like whatever he was, which in her experience was the rarest variety of man available. He was lean in the way of men who work outdoors and sleep lightly, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness in the set of his jaw. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw from a skirmish in the Dakota Territory 9 years ago, and he had come home from the cavalry changed in the specific way that men come home from war, changed quieter, more watchful, with a patience that could be mistaken for stillness. "You've been here the whole time," he said. It was not a question. "I have." The telegram said peaceful. It was mostly. He slept a great deal near the end. He didn't suffer. Luke nodded slowly. He was looking around the kitchen in the way of a man cataloging what has changed in a place he has not visited in 6 months, and something in his expression shifted when he looked at the small vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. Yellow bunch flowers, bone dry, now petals papery and translucent. Eleanor had put them there the previous autumn because Henry had liked to sit at the kitchen table some mornings with his coffee and look at the window, and she had thought the color pleased him. "He asked for you," Luke said. "Near the end, Clem told me." "Clem talks a great deal," Eleanor said. "He said father called for you by name more than once." Eleanor turned back to the kettle. "Your father was not always lucid near the end. Would you like coffee, Mr. Blackstone? There's biscuits if you haven't eaten." She did not look at him, but she heard him pull out the chair at the kitchen table and sit down. He had always done that, sat at the kitchen table while she worked years ago, when he would visit the ranch during his cavalry leave, asking her questions about the ranch operations, or just sitting quietly while she made dinner. He had been the only Blackstone child who did that. "The service is at 11, she said. "The roads may be difficult." "I know the roads," he said. She put a mug of coffee in front of him and a plate of biscuits beside it, and went back to the parlor to finish with the pine branches. Behind her she heard him eat, and she heard him drink the coffee, and she heard him set the mug down with the particular careful quietness of a man who has spent time learning not to disturb people. Cham. The church in Harlan's Fork was the largest building in town, and it filled to the edges for Henry Blackstone's funeral, which would not have surprised Henry at all. He had been a man who understood exactly how much space he took up in the world. Eleanor sat in the second-to-last pew on the right side behind a family of neighboring ranchers she did not know well, and she listened to the eulogy that the Reverend delivered from notes. Henry had apparently written himself. Eleanor recognized the phrasing, and she sang the hymns in a voice that she kept carefully quiet so as not to be noticed. She was good at that, not being noticed. The Blackstone family sat in the first 2 rows as was appropriate. Richard and Constance, Caroline rigid and composed, Luke at the end of the family pew sitting with the particular careful stillness of a man who has attended a great many funerals and has made his peace with the public nature of grief. Across the aisle in the pew directly opposite Eleanor sat Samuel Finch. He was a small, tidy man of 60 with a gray beard he kept precisely trimmed and small steel-rimmed spectacles. He had been the Blackstone family's attorney for 20 years. Eleanor had dealt with him on various matters of ranch business over the years and found him thorough, discreet, and considerably smarter than he preferred to appear, which she had always considered a professional asset. He caught her eye once during the service and gave her a very small nod. She returned it and looked back at the front of the church. After the burial, the family returned to Blackstone Ranch for the dinner that Eleanor and Mrs. Aldrich had prepared, and the neighboring families came too, and the ranch hands came in from the bunkhouse in their good clothes, and the house was full of the particular uncomfortable warmth of a Western funeral, gathering the food heavy and plentiful. The whiskey circulating, the conversation running in currents that occasionally surfaced into something real, and then submerged again quickly under the weight of civility. Eleanor moved through it all, serving and managing and replenishing. She spoke when spoken to. She kept the whiskey decanter full. At the long dinner table, surrounded by the neighbors and their wives, Richard Blackstone ate his 4th helping of roast beef and said in the caring voice of a man who has never had reason to lower it, "Once the estate is settled, we won't need the housekeeper anymore." He was speaking to the neighbor on his left, a rancher named Gartner, whom Eleanor barely knew, but the words were loud enough to reach 3/4 of the table, and Eleanor, who was refilling the water pitcher at the sideboard not 10 feet away, heard them perfectly well. No one objected. Constance Blackstone examined her dinner fork. Caroline Blackstone turned to speak to the woman on her right. Gartner made a non-committal sound and reached for the bread. Luke at the far end of the table set down his knife and looked at his brother for a long moment. But he did not say anything either, because what was there to say? And Eleanor did not look at any of them. She finished filling the water pitcher and moved around the table refilling glasses, and she kept her face the way she always kept it: quiet, composed, unreadable. And inside the architecture of that composure, she put Richard's words in the place she kept all the things that were said about her, as though she were not standing right there, and she continued to work. It was what she had always done. Chetum. Samuel Finch arrived 3 days after the funeral on a Thursday morning with his leather case under his arm and snow on his boots, and he accepted the cup of coffee Eleanor offered him and sat in the parlor to wait for the family to assemble. Richard came down from the study where he had spent the past 3 days, reviewing what Eleanor had heard him call the books. Though what he meant by that she was uncertain, because the household accounts had always been Eleanor's domain, and the ranch accounts had always been managed by the head foreman Ben Tillis under Henry's supervision. Caroline came down in a good dress which she had not worn since the funeral, which Eleanor noted. Luke came last from the direction of the barn, and he paused in the doorway of the parlor to stamp his boots before stepping onto the rug, which Eleanor did not note because it was simply Luke being Luke. "Mrs. Price," Finch said, looking up at her as she moved to leave. "Would you stay, please? I'll need you present." Richard looked up from his seat by the window. Caroline's expression did not change, but her posture did a slight reordering of her spine that Eleanor recognized as attention. "I can wait in the kitchen," Eleanor offered. "I prefer you here," Finch said. Henry was specific. She took the chair nearest the door, the one she always chose in rooms where she was present on sufferance, close enough to leave quickly, far enough back to be outside the primary conversation. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Finch opened his case with the practiced efficiency of a man who has read a great many wills and knows that no amount of preparation adequately prepares anyone for the reading of one. He arranged his papers on the small table beside his chair, settled his spectacles, and cleared his throat. Henry Blackstone's estate was considerable. Richard and Caroline both knew this. The land alone, 4,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, was worth more than most men in Harlan's Fork would see in 3 lifetimes. There were the cattle. There was the house. There were various smaller holding shares in the Harlan's Fork Bank, a note against a neighboring property, some bonds. Finch read through this preliminary provisions, the bequests to the church, the small amounts left to the ranch hands, who had served longest, and the family shifted in their seats with the particular restlessness of people waiting for the real numbers. Then Finch turned the page and said, "To Eleanor Grace Price, who has served this household with a faithfulness and a quiet courage that this family does not deserve, but which I nonetheless hope it will honor the ranch house and its grounds in fee. Simple, along with a 40% interest in annual net ranch profits, and the authority to oversee and direct ranch operations for so long as she chooses to do so." The room held still for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then Richard said, "I beg your pardon." Finch continued reading. There were other provisions. Luke received the southern pasture lands outright along with certain financial instruments. Richard and Caroline each received portions of the cattle holdings. But the house that Richard had been sleeping in, the house Henry Blackstone had built with his own hands in 1859, belonged to Eleanor Price. Richard was on his feet before Finch had finished the paragraph. "That is absurd," he said. "That is absolutely. Father was not in his right mind. He was ill for months. There is no possible. Your father was of sound mind when this will was executed," Finch said with the calm of a man who has anticipated this particular response. "I can provide documentation." Dr. Waverly was present. "He was manipulated." Richard's voice had gone flat and cold, which was more alarming than when it was loud. "Someone in this household manipulated an old man, and I think we all know who." Eleanor did not look at Richard. She looked at her hands in her lap. "Richard," Luke said. "No." Richard turned to his brother. "No. This is not the time for your cavalry officer patience, Luke. This is our inheritance. This house is our inheritance. We grew up in this house. And now we're being told that—" He stopped. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized and had expected and had had years to prepare for. "Did you put him up to this?" "Mr. Blackstone," Eleanor said in the voice she used when she needed to be clear without being combative, "I did not know the contents of your father's will." "That's convenient." "It's the truth." You were alone with him for months. You were the one person in this house who had... Richard, Luke's voice harder this time. Richard stopped. Caroline, who had not said anything, looked at Eleanor with eyes that were doing considerably more calculation than her face admitted. "We'll want to speak with you, Mrs. Price," she said. "Privately, when Mr. Finch is finished." "Of course," Eleanor said. Finch finished reading. He produced a sealed envelope from the bottom of his case and set it on the table. The envelope was addressed in Henry Blackstone's handwriting. Eleanor recognized it immediately, the particular, careful script of a man who had not gone to much schooling but had taught himself to write well by sheer stubbornness. On the front below the address, Henry had written to be read aloud. Finch opened it and read, "Eleanor knows the truth about what happened in 1864. I have carried that truth alone for 30 years because I was too proud and too ashamed to share it. Whatever my children may think of the provisions of this will, I ask them to speak to Eleanor before they speak to anyone else. She will tell you what I could not." The room was very quiet. 1864, Caroline said slowly as though she were working out arithmetic. "That's 30 years before any of us were adults," Luke said. He was looking at Eleanor, not with accusation, not yet, but with the particular focused attention of a man who has learned that the things people don't say are often more important than the things they do. Eleanor looked back at him. She did not look away. "I think," she said, "that we should let Mr. Finch finish his business before we discuss anything further." Finch nodded, grateful, Eleanor suspected, for the brief return to procedural ground. He gathered his papers. He would return in a week, he said, to answer any legal questions they had about the estate. He reminded them that the will had been properly witnessed and notarized and had been filed with the county clerk. He said all of this in the measured tone of a man who knows he is delivering a grenade and wants to be at a safe distance before anyone pulls the pin. Then he accepted his coat from Eleanor, who fetched it for him from the hall, and he shook her hand briefly, a small, dry handshake that nonetheless carried in it 30 years of professional confidence, and he left. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, listening to the particular silence of a room in which 3 adults were deciding what to do with their shock. Then she went to the kitchen and began clearing the coffee things, because the kitchen was where she worked, and work was what she did, and she was going to need every bit of the steadiness that 30 years of habit could provide. The town took the news the way small towns take all remarkable news, with speed, appetite, and a great deal of creative interpretation. Eleanor had not told anyone. Finch had not told anyone. But Richard Blackstone was not a discreet man, and within 24 hours of the will reading the story, was moving through Harlan's Fork with the efficient velocity of something that everyone wants to know. By the end of the week, the version circulating at the general store held that Eleanor Price had bewitched old Henry Blackstone in his final months. The version at the saloon held that she had been his secret companion for decades, which was not true, and which Eleanor found simultaneously insulting and tedious. The version circulating among the women of the Methodist Church was more sympathetic. There was a school of thought that held Eleanor had simply been a faithful servant, rewarded by a grateful employer. But it was the minority position, and it was drowned out by the more interesting versions. Eleanor heard all of this in the way she heard most things, at a slight remove through the carefully maintained distance that had served her since she was 28 years old, and had come to Blackstone Ranch with nothing but a good reference from her previous employer and the knowledge that she needed a position in a place where no one knew her history. She had been widowed at 27. Her husband James had been a decent man and a poor farmer, and he had died of a fever in the winter of 1864, leaving her with a small amount of debt and no children and no family close enough to help. She had sold what there was to sell, paid what there was to pay, and taken the train west, because going west was what you did when your life in the East came apart. She had arrived at Blackstone Ranch in the spring of 1864. Henry had been 48, then newly widowed himself with 3 children under 12, and a household that was running on the labor of women who were themselves exhausted. And she had asked for the position of housekeeper, and received it, and she had never left. There was more to it than that, of course. There was always more to it than that. But Eleanor had long since made peace with the fact that the longer story was hers to keep, and no one else's business, and the provisions of Henry Blackstone's will did not change that. What the provisions of the will did change was considerably more practical. Eleanor Price was no longer the housekeeper of Blackstone Ranch. She was by the explicit written instructions of its late owner, its manager, its legal occupant, and the beneficiary of 40% of its annual profits. These were not small things. These were in fact quite large things, and Eleanor was old enough and clear-eyed enough to understand that navigating them would require every bit of the steadiness and competence she possessed, and possibly a bit more. She began as she always began, with large problems, by going to work. Checkpoint. The morning after the will reading, she rose at her usual hour, dressed in her usual gray wool, and went to the kitchen. Mrs. Aldridge was already there, bless her Mrs. Aldridge, who had cooked at Blackstone Ranch for 11 years and had never, to Eleanor's knowledge, wasted a word on any topic she considered settled. She looked up when Eleanor came in and said, "I heard." "I imagine most people have," Eleanor said. "What are you going to do?" "The same thing I always do." Eleanor tied on her apron and went to the window to check the temperature. "Manage the ranch." Mrs. Aldridge considered this for a moment, then went back to her bread dough. "Richard's going to make trouble," she said. "Probably." "And Caroline?" "Possibly." "And the town?" "The town will think what it thinks," Eleanor said. "I can't help that." She paused, then added, "Could you make the buckwheat cakes this morning? Mr. Luke likes them." Mrs. Aldridge made the buckwheat cakes without comment, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could have said. Luke came to breakfast at his usual time alone, and he sat at the kitchen table, not at the dining room table where Richard and Caroline had taken their meals since their arrival, and he ate 3 buckwheat cakes with a thoroughness that suggested a man who had not been sleeping enough but understood the importance of eating regardless. Eleanor refilled his coffee without being asked. "I'd like to go over the ranch books with you today," he said, "if you're willing." Eleanor looked at him. "Your brother already has the household accounts." "I know." He set down his fork. "I mean the real books, the operational accounts, the ones Ben Tillis keeps. Those belong to Ben." "They belong to the ranch," Luke said. "And by the terms of the will, half of the ranch operations are now under your authority." 40%, she corrected. 40%, he agreed. "I think that still qualifies you to look at the books." Eleanor untied her apron, which was a signal in the private language of her own habits that she was shifting from one kind of work to another. "Ben Tillis isn't going to like it," she said. "Ben Tillis doesn't have to like it. He just has to do it." That's a very cavalry way to think about a foreman. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, like a match being lit in a distant room. "I've been out of the cavalry a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you have." She meant it as a simple fact, and he received it as one, and together they went across the snow to the foreman's office. Ben Tillis had been Henry Blackstone's head foreman for 16 years. He was 53 years old, a short, leather-skinned man with hands so permanently work-roughened that they looked like something carved rather than grown. He kept the ranch operational accounts in a wooden cabinet behind his desk. 3 ledgers, one for each year's operations, with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that a ranch lives or dies by its numbers. He received Eleanor and Luke with the particular wariness of a man who respects his employers but is not entirely certain who his employers are anymore, and he opened the current ledger on his desk without being asked. Eleanor had managed household accounts for 30 years. She had a facility with numbers that was, she knew, somewhat at odds with what people expected of a housekeeper, but then most people's expectations of housekeepers were, in her experience, somewhat limited. She sat across from Tillis's desk and read through the current year's numbers with the careful attention she gave everything, and what she found when she did made the particular small cold knot form in her stomach that she had learned over the years to treat not as fear, but as information. The ranch was not doing well. Not catastrophically, not yet, but not well. The cattle losses in the previous autumn's early freeze had been heavier than she had known, because the ranch ledgers had never been her particular domain, and Henry had not offered, and she had not asked. There was an outstanding note with a Billings bank that was due in 60 days. There was a disputed water rights claim from a neighboring property the Hatcher spread to the north that had been quietly gathering legal fees for 2 years. There was a shortfall in the projected spring calf numbers that, based on what she was reading, would need to be corrected before the summer markets. "How long has the Billings note been outstanding?" she asked Tillis. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable, and then he looked at Luke, who nodded. 14 months, Tillis said. "What's the rate?" 9%. She was quiet for a moment, reading back through the figures. "Did Mr. Blackstone know?" "He knew," Tillis said. "He kept saying he'd see to it when the spring market came good. Then the spring market didn't come good. Then he got sick." She nodded. She turned to the previous year's ledger and then the one before that, going back carefully, and she found what she was already half expecting to find, that the ranch's troubles were not new. They were the accumulated weight of several years of bad weather, falling beef prices, and an aging infrastructure that needed investment it had not received. The ranch looked prosperous on the surface. It was well maintained, the stock was respectable, the house was a fine house, but underneath the surface were the kinds of problems that could become very large very quickly if someone didn't address them and soon. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. "Richard knows some of it," Tillis said. "He's been in the book since he arrived." "Caroline." "She hasn't asked." Eleanor closed the ledger. She looked at Luke, who was sitting on the edge of a bale near the door with his arms crossed, and an expression that suggested he had already been calculating and had arrived at the same place she had. "It's manageable," she said. Tillis looked at her with what she recognized as the beginning of a reassessment. "The Billings note can be renegotiated if approached correctly. The water rights claim is more complicated, but not insoluble." She paused. "The cattle losses will need to be offset by the spring purchase being careful and the summer market being decent. That's the variable we can't control." She looked at Tillis directly. "You've seen worse." He thought about it. "Once," he said, "a long time ago." "So have I," she said. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, because they had never been warm with each other, but a kind of mutual acknowledgement that each of them was older than the current crisis and had survived previous ones. Tillis reached into the cabinet and pulled out a fourth ledger, older than the others. Its spine cracked and its cover worn to a color somewhere between brown and black, and set it on the desk. "Mr. Blackstone left this with instruction that it was to stay here unless Mrs. Price asked for it," he said. He said it in the manner of a man reading from a script he had memorized but not composed. Eleanor looked at the ledger. She looked at Tillis. "Henry left those instructions about 8 months ago," he said, "before he got too sick to be giving instructions." She reached out and put her hand on the ledger but did not open it. "Not yet, not here with Tillis watching and Luke watching and the particular weight of whatever was inside it pressing upward through the cover." "Thank you, Ben," she said in a tone that was both a genuine thank you and a gentle dismissal. And Tillis, who had worked alongside Eleanor Price long enough to know the difference between her two kinds of quiet, picked up his hat and went to see about the horses. The ledger was old. Eleanor could see that. From the outside, the paper of the cover had that dense, yellowed quality that paper gets when it has spent decades in conditions that are alternately dry and damp, as every ranch building in Montana is. The spine had been re-sewn at some point with a slightly different thread than the original binding, and the pages, when she opened it, had the translucent fragility of things that have been consulted many times. It covered the years 1864 through 1873. Henry Blackstone's hand was on every page, his particular cramped, careful numbers, the same numbers she had seen on household requisitions and payroll sheets for 30 years. Luke had moved to sit beside her at the desk. She was aware of him in the way she was always aware of people who were paying genuine attention, not intrusively, but with a kind of peripheral precision. The way you're aware of a fire in a room, the warmth of it, the source, the steady fact of its presence. She found what she was looking for in the entries for May of 1864. Note received E.G. Randall, personal inheritance, $800. Applied to payroll arrears and feed account as follows. The rest of the page was figures, a great many figures. Behind it, 3 more pages of figures. And then at the end, in different ink than the surrounding entries added later, she thought possibly much later, a single line in Henry Blackstone's hand. "This debt will never be adequately repaid, but I will try." Luke was reading over her shoulder. She did not pull the ledger away. "E.G. Randall," he said, "your maiden name." "My husband's name," she said. "I kept it after James died. It was easier than going back to Price with the references." $800, he said. He said it in the tone of a man for whom that amount of money in 1864 had a specific and considerable weight. "It was my entire inheritance from my mother," she said, "along with what James left." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind in the eaves and the sound of the horses in the adjacent barn, and somewhere further off, the iron clang of someone working in the smithy. "The drought," Luke said. "I remember hearing about it. I was 10. 1864 was a very bad year," Eleanor said. "The drought started in the spring and ran through August. The grass in the south pastures failed completely. Your father lost a third of the herd to starvation before the autumn rain came, and by then he was behind on payroll by 2 months, and behind on feed by more than that." She paused. "He was going to sell, to the ranch, everything, the land, the cattle, the house. He had a buyer in Billings who was ready to take it all at 30 cents on the dollar. She closed the ledger carefully. He told me he was leaving. He asked me to manage the house until the sale closed. And instead I had $800, she said. My mother had died the previous year and left me what she had, and I had added James's life insurance to it because I had no use for it immediately, and I intended to decide later what to do with it. $800 in 1864 was enough to cover 2 months' payroll in the most urgent of the feed accounts. She looked at the cover of the ledger. I went to your father and I told him that I wished to lend the ranch the money, that it was a business arrangement, that he could repay me with interest when the herd recovered. He took it. He was a practical man. A pause. He was also humiliated by it, which I understood. A man in his position being bailed out by the housekeeper is not a story he wanted to tell, and I never told it, and I never asked him to. I asked only that the arrangement be recorded properly in the ledgers, which it was. Did he repay you? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He tried, she said. He made 2 payments. Then the winter of 1867 was very bad, and he needed that money back. I told him to keep it. She stood up from the chair and moved to the window. I had a position. I had a room and food and a salary. I didn't need the capital the way the ranch did. Luke was quiet for long enough that Eleanor turned to look at him. He was sitting very still in the way she had seen him sit still before. Not the stillness of someone who had nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who was deciding which of many things was most important to say first. The second letter, he said. Finch mentioned a second letter. Did he? He said Henry left instruction for a second sealed document, to be opened if your reputation came under attack. A pause. It sounds like your reputation has come under attack. The town will sort itself out, she said. They always do. That's not an answer. No, she said, it isn't. She turned back to the window. Ask Finch about the letter if you want to know what's in it. It isn't mine to open. It's about you. A great many things in this ranch's history are about me, she said with a precision that was not quite sharpness. And a great many of them are mine to keep and the rest belong to the ranch. They're not the same thing. She picked up the old ledger and held it against her chest. I'll be in the house if you need me, Mr. Blackstone. She walked out of the foreman's office into the cold, and she did not hurry and she did not look back. And behind her the wind came down from the north and pushed along the tops of the fence posts and sent a fine skirl of snow across the yard. Askariem. Richard found her in the study that afternoon. He did not knock. Richard Blackstone had not knocked on a door in this house in 30 years, because why would you knock in a house you grew up in? And Eleanor did not look up from the household ledger she was reviewing when the door opened. I want to talk to you, he said. I'm listening, she said and continued writing. He came to stand in front of the desk. She had worked at this desk for 20 years ever since Henry had stopped using the study for much of anything, and she had taken it over by practical default, a fact that Richard was now, she suspected, reckoning with in ways that were not comfortable for him. You understand, he said, that this will not stand. She set down her pen. She looked at him. Richard in person was not an easy man to face. He was large and red-faced and certain in the specific way of men who have not had to be uncertain very often. But Eleanor had been managing difficult men since she was a girl, and she did not find him particularly more difficult than average. I understand that you intend to contest the will, she said. That is your legal right. I intend to contest it, and I intend to find out what you said to my father to make him think. I said nothing to your father about the will, she said. Henry made his own decisions. He always did. You were alone with him for months. I was caring for him. That is what I was employed to do. She paused. What I have always been employed to do. Richard leaned forward, putting both hands flat on the desk in a way that she suspected was meant to be intimidating and was in fact merely annoying. You've been running up and down the halls of this house for 30 years, he said, cooking and cleaning and managing the housemaids. That doesn't entitle you to a share of my father's estate. Your father thought otherwise. My father was dying. Your father was 78 years old, Eleanor said, and he had been making his intentions clear in his ledgers for over 20 years. If you would like to review the documentation, I believe Mr. Finch can arrange access. She held his gaze steadily. I would also suggest that before you retain an attorney to contest the will, you review the ranch's outstanding financial obligations, because there are several that will require prompt attention regardless of the legal situation, and the sooner you understand them, the better positioned you'll be. Richard straightened. He was recalibrating. She could see at the shift in his face when the expected script isn't working and he has to find a different one. What obligations, he said. Ask Ben Tillis, she said. Or Luke. Luke has seen the ledgers. She picked up her pen and went back to the household accounts. Richard stood in front of the desk for another moment, and then he went out, closing the door behind him, and Eleanor did not release her breath until she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Then she set down her pen again and pressed both palms flat on the desk and looked out the window at the gray February afternoon. And she let herself feel for exactly the length of one slow breath in and one slow breath out, the full weight of what the next several months were going to cost her. Then she picked up the pen and went back to work. Baton. The rumors moved through Harlan's Fork with the efficiency of a good cattle drive, organized, directed, arriving at their destination faster than anyone expected. By the second week after the funeral, the basic facts of the will had been overtaken by a more elaborate version. Eleanor Price had spent 30 years ingratiating herself with Henry Blackstone. She had isolated him from his family. In his final months, she had whispered, God knew what, into the ear of a dying man. People said it with the specific confidence of people who know they are speculating, but have decided that the speculation is probably true. Eleanor heard it all. The woman who ran the dry goods store could not quite look at her directly when she came in for supplies. Two women from the church she had attended for 15 years crossed the street when they saw her coming. Old Patterson, who ran the livery stable and had always greeted her with the particular warmth he reserved for people he trusted, took her horse without meeting her eyes. She bought what she needed at the dry goods store. She said good morning to the women who crossed the street loudly enough that they had to hear it. She gave Patterson a fair tip and did not comment on his silence. She did these things because they were the things you did, and because the alternative, retreating, staying on the ranch, sending the housemaids to town in her place, was the kind of accommodation that started small and ended large, and Eleanor had spent 30 years refusing accommodations that would diminish her. On the ranch itself, the atmosphere was considerably more complicated. Richard had retained an attorney in Billings, a man named Greaves, whose reputation, Finch told Eleanor quietly, was for aggressive litigation and a willingness to use procedural delays as a financial weapon. The implication was plain, even if Richard's legal case was weak, which Finch thought it was the process of contesting the will could be made sufficiently expensive and exhausting to compel settlement. Caroline had not retained anyone yet. She was watching. Eleanor respected that more than Richard's immediate aggression. A watching Caroline was a calculating Caroline, and a calculating Caroline was a Caroline who had not yet decided what her best option was, which meant the situation was still fluid. Luke was harder to read. He stayed on the ranch, which she had not expected. His own place, the small spread he'd built south of Harlan's Fork after leaving the cavalry, had its own spring work to see to, and she had assumed he would return to it once the immediate business of the funeral was settled. Instead, he remained, and he came to the foreman's office most mornings and went through the ranch books with Tillis, and he rode the fence lines in the afternoons. And he came back to the house in the evenings with the cold still on him, and ate dinner at the kitchen table and asked Eleanor questions. The questions were good questions. She found herself answering them more fully than she had intended to. The drought of 1866, the cattle disease that had taken 200 head. In 1871, the labor strike among the ranch hands. In 1878, that she had quietly resolved by negotiating better bunkhouse conditions and a small pay increase while Henry was in Billings and would not have to admit to having authorized them. Luke listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man who is assembling something from pieces that have been scattered, and he asked follow-up questions that suggested he understood what she was telling him and was connecting it to things he already knew. You handled the labor situation, he said one evening. The 1878 strike. It wasn't a strike, Eleanor said carefully. It was a work slowdown. That's a distinction that probably mattered at the time. It mattered considerably, she said. A strike would have required your father's formal acknowledgement and response. A slowdown could be resolved through other channels. She paused, watching her hands fold a dish towel. If your father had been present, he would have handled it the way he handled most labor challenges, which was to fire the leaders and dare the rest to object. That would have cost the ranch 8 of its best hands at the beginning of calving season. So instead I met with the men's representative, a man named Foster. He'd been with the ranch 11 years good with the horses, not a troublemaker by nature. I listened to what they were asking for, which was mostly reasonable. I took it to Henry as a list of proposed operational improvements that I was recommending for efficiency reasons, and he approved them because he trusted my judgment on household and operational matters. Luke looked at her across the kitchen table. He never knew it was you who brokered it. He knew, she said. Not then. Later, when he'd had time to think about it. She set the dish towel down. Henry was not an unintelligent man. He was sometimes a proud one, which is a different thing. He understood eventually what I had done and why. We never discussed it directly, but he knew. And you never claimed credit for it. Credit isn't the point. She said it without impatience because it wasn't a criticism, just a different way of thinking about things. The ranch needed the hands needed better conditions. The argument about who deserves acknowledgement is secondary to whether the thing gets done. Luke was quiet for a moment. Then that letter, the second one, Finch came by today. Eleanor looked up. He said it's ready to be opened. He said Henry's instruction was that it required your consent as well as family presence, because it concerns both. She thought about that. She had known the second letter existed. Henry had told her in the last months that he had written it, though he had not told her what was in it. She had her suspicions. She was not certain she was ready for her suspicions to become facts in front of Richard Blackstone and his Billings attorney. When does he want to do it? She said. He left the timing to you. She nodded. She picked up the dish towel again and went to the stove. Tell him Thursday, she said. That gives me 2 days to make sure the spring supply order is placed. She heard Luke's smile, which was not something you heard so much as sensed a change in the quality of his silence, a minor adjustment in the room's atmosphere. The supply order, he said. The ranch needs to eat Mr. Blackstone, she said without turning around, regardless of what's in the letter. Yaka. The second reading took place on a Thursday afternoon in the same parlor as the first, though this time Richard's attorney Greaves was also present, which made the room feel smaller and more adversarial. Greaves was a thin man of 50 with the particular professional quality of leanness that suggests a diet of other people's disputes. He sat beside Richard with his own case on his knees and said nothing, which Eleanor found more unnerving than if he had said something. Finch read the second letter aloud. It was considerably longer than the first. Henry Blackstone had written it in the winter of 1892, when he had known his health was declining but had not yet known how quickly. He had written it in the voice he used for business correspondence, precise, spare, occasionally awkward, always honest, and it covered in order the drought of 1864, and Eleanor's loan, the labor resolution of 1878, a legal dispute in 1881 over water rights on the East Pasture that Eleanor had resolved without Henry's knowledge by quietly negotiating an arrangement with the neighboring rancher that had held for 13 years the payroll crisis of 1884, when Henry had been away for 6 weeks dealing with a family matter in Ohio, and the cattle market had collapsed, and Eleanor had on her own authority sold 3 of the ranch's horses to keep the men paid, and approximately a dozen smaller incidents across 30 years, in which Eleanor had, through competence or sacrifice or sheer stubborn attention, prevented some damage to the ranch that would otherwise have been very expensive. Henry had documented each incident. He had been precise about dates and amounts. He had clearly been keeping his own private record for years. At the end, he had written, Eleanor Price has never asked me for anything in 30 years of service, which is one of the great injustices of my oversight of this ranch and this household. She did not manipulate me. She did not scheme against my children. She gave this ranch her inheritance and her savings and 20 years of decisions that she had no business making and made anyway because no one else was making them. Whatever my children think of the provisions I have made for her, they should understand that they are receiving not a diminishment of their inheritance, but rather a portion of what should have been hers long since. The room was quiet for a very long time after Finch finished reading. Richard's attorney Greaves made a small note in his leather-bound notebook and said nothing. Richard himself sat with his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is restructuring his position while trying not to appear to be doing so. Caroline was the one who surprised Eleanor. She had been sitting through the reading with her usual composed attention, and when Finch finished, she looked at Eleanor, a long, direct look of the kind that Caroline did not often give people because Caroline generally looked at the space around people rather than at them directly, and said, "The East Pasture water rights. 13 years ago." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That was the year Father said he'd sorted out the Delaney situation." "The Delaney situation sorted itself," Eleanor said carefully. "I simply helped along the sorting." Caroline was quiet for another moment. "I see," she said in a tone that could have meant several things. Greaves said into the silence, "This letter, while emotionally compelling, does not materially affect the legal question of testamentary capacity." "Mr. Greaves," Luke said, "with respect, my father's testamentary capacity is not the question before us right now. Your client—" "My brother can speak for himself," Luke said, still in the same level tone. Or he can let the attorney speak for him, but that's a choice, not a necessity. Richard looked at Luke with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years being the eldest and is not accustomed to being managed by his youngest sibling. I'm not going to pretend, he said, that this changes everything. I'm not asking you to pretend anything, Luke said. I'm asking you to read what Father wrote and decide what you actually think about it. What I think, Richard said, is that Father was a sentimental old man who... He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said in a different voice, $13,000. What? Caroline said. The amounts in that letter. If you add them all up. He was doing the arithmetic in his head. Eleanor could see it. That's what she put into this ranch across 30 years, not counting the labor. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she did not have a name for immediately, and then she placed it. It was the expression of a man who has been wrong and knows it and is deciding whether to say so. He did not say so. Not yet. But he picked up his hat from the arm of his chair, which meant something. I'd like to take this evening to think, he said. He looked at Greaves. Stand down for now. Greaves looked as though he had bitten something unexpectedly sour, but he nodded. Richard stood up and left the parlor, and after a moment Constance followed him, and then Greaves and Finch began gathering his papers. Caroline remained. The 1884 payroll, she said when the others were gone. When Father was in Ohio. Yes, Eleanor said. He was there because of me, Caroline said. I'd had a difficult year. He came to help. Eleanor looked at her. I know, she said. He never told me that someone had to sell horses to make payroll while he was gone. It wasn't his story to tell, Eleanor said. It was ranch business. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been unfair to you, in what I assumed. You weren't wrong to ask questions, Eleanor said carefully. The provisions of the will are unusual. Your skepticism was reasonable. My skepticism was reasonable, Caroline repeated. But my manner was not. She stood up. She smoothed her skirt in the way she always smoothed her skirt when she was uncomfortable, 3 careful strokes from hip to hem. I don't think I can get Richard to drop the contest immediately. I know, but I think I can slow him down. Eleanor looked at her. Caroline held her gaze with the directness that Eleanor had always found beneath its challenge to be one of her better qualities. Thank you, Eleanor said. Caroline nodded once, a firm and undemonstrative nod, and left. March came in with mud and melt in the first tentative signs of spring green needling up through the brown. In the south pastures, the creek running higher and faster with snowmelt from the mountains. The earliest wildflowers, the bunch flowers, the ones that could take a late freeze without flinching, appearing at the edges of the yard. Eleanor was watching them from the kitchen window very early on a March morning when she became aware that she had not been alone in the kitchen for some minutes. She turned. Luke was in the doorway, fully dressed with the particular alertness of a man who has been up since before first light. Something happened, she said. It was not a question. Last night, he said, after dark. He came into the kitchen and went to the window. Someone cut 3 sections of the north fence line. The cattle in the north pasture are loose. Eleanor was already untying her apron. Which way did they go? North, toward the Hatcher spread. The Hatcher spread was the neighboring property with the outstanding water rights dispute. The one that had been quietly accumulating legal fees for 2 years. Eleanor pulled on her coat and said, Tell me everything. He told her as they crossed the yard in the early gray light, walking fast toward the foreman's office. Someone no one had seen who had cut 3 sections of the north fence line that bordered the Hatcher property. The cattle from the north pasture, perhaps 200 head, had gone through the gaps in the night. Some had already been found and turned back. Others had gone further. And Hatcher's foreman had been seen at first light before anyone from Blackstone Ranch had known the cattle were out riding toward Harlan's Fork. He's going to impound them, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, a statement of fact rather than alarm. That's my reading, Luke said. Can he legally, under territorial law, straying cattle found on adjacent property can be held pending resolution of any outstanding claims between the properties? Luke's voice carried the specific precision of a man who has spent the past week reading legal documents. The Hatcher dispute is outstanding. How many head do we still have loose? Tillis thinks maybe 60 to 80. At current market, that's, she calculated quickly, $800 to $1,000 if he holds them long enough for us to have to pay a claim to get them back. A pause. Plus the cost of rounding them up. Yes, and the fence cuts. Someone took wire cutters to 3 sections, Luke said. Not where, not whether. Cut clean. Eleanor thought about that. The Hatcher dispute has been dormant, she said. 2 years of legal fees and no action from either side. Why would they? I don't think it's the Hatchers, Luke said. She looked at him. Hatcher is a cautious man, Luke said. He doesn't do dramatic things. He waits. This isn't his way of managing a water dispute. He paused. The Montana Land Syndicate has been buying up properties east of Harlan's Fork for the past 6 months. They paid Greeley's widow above market last November. They've been approaching 3 other ranches. I know, Eleanor said. She stopped walking. I know about the syndicate. She had known for 4 months. She had written to Finch about it in November because that was the kind of thing you wrote to an attorney about, and she had been waiting to see what they would do next. Blackstone Ranch is the largest remaining privately held property in this valley, Luke said. If the family is fighting publicly over the inheritance, if the ranch is showing financial weakness, if there are legal disputes outstanding, he paused. They move in when the water's troubled. That's their way. Eleanor looked across the north pasture. The morning light was coming up gray and thin over the mountains, and she could see in the distance the dark shapes of cattle on the wrong side of a fence line. The note in Billings, she said. Did you go over that with Tillis? Yesterday. It's due in 51 days. I need to go to Billings, she said, in the next 2 weeks before the syndicate has time to approach the bank about the note. Luke was very still beside her. You have leverage with the bank. Henry dealt with Billings Territorial Savings for 20 years, she said. I wrote half the correspondence. The bank manager alderman knows my hand, if not my name. She paused. And I have 40% of annual ranch profits by the terms of the will. That's not a bad negotiating position if the ranch books are properly presented. With the cattle loose and the fence cut, the cattle will be rounded up, the fence will be repaired. She pulled her coat tighter. Go find Tillis and get every man on the fence and the cattle. I'll deal with breakfast for the remaining hands. Eleanor. His voice stopped her. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had begun to recognize over the past weeks. Not pity, which she would not have tolerated, but something more complicated. Attention, she had decided. The way some men looked at a problem they were genuinely trying to solve. Why didn't you go to Billings yourself in November when you found out about the syndicate? She considered the question. It was a fair one. Because in November, she said Henry was alive and I was the housekeeper. I had no standing to negotiate a ranch financial matter on the property owner's behalf without his explicit instruction. And now, she said, I have 40% of annual profits and the authority to oversee ranch operations. Henry was quite specific. She turned back toward the kitchen. Go find Tillis. She did not wait to see if he moved. She had learned over 30 years that Luke Blackstone, unlike his brother, moved when he decided to move, and the deciding took the time it took, and rushing it produced nothing good. Behind her, she heard his boots on the frozen ground, heading for the bunkhouse. Yatam. She went to Billings on a Tuesday in the second week of March on the train that left Harlan's Fork at 7 in the morning and arrived in Billings at noon. She wore her better gray dress, not the wool she wore every day, but a slightly finer wool with a fitted waist. The dress she had bought the previous year for the district cattlemen's meeting that Henry had asked her to attend in his place when his knees had been too bad for the journey. She carried her leather satchel with the ranch financial documents, the current ledger, the balance sheet she had prepared, the correspondence history with the bank, and she sat in the second-class car and reviewed her figures until she had them as solid and clear in her mind as a well-built fence. The bank manager alderman received her in his office with the particular careful expression of a man who has received a great many women in his office and has generally found them to be there on behalf of someone else. He was in his early 60s, plump and correct with a silver watch chain across his waistcoat that he touched periodically in the way of men who need something to hold while they think. Eleanor set the ranch documents on his desk. I am Eleanor Price, she said. I have managed the accounts and correspondence of Blackstone Ranch for 30 years. You have a note against this ranch issued 14 months ago at 9% due in 49 days. I'm here to discuss extending the terms. Alderman looked at the documents. He looked at her. He touched his watch chain. Mrs. Price, Henry Blackstone's housekeeper. Among other things, she said. By the terms of Henry Blackstone's will, which was filed with the county clerk on February 12th of this year, I hold 40% interest in annual ranch profits and authority over ranch operations. I can provide a copy of the relevant provision if that's useful. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he looked at the documents, and she saw the precise moment that he recognized her handwriting. In the ranch correspondence, he had seen it for 20 years, just never known whose it was. You wrote the quarterly reports, he said. I did. I assumed... He stopped. He cleared his throat. I assumed Henry Blackstone wrote them himself. Henry Blackstone dictated them. she said, which was close enough to true. I drafted the final versions. She paused. The ranch's financial position is currently complicated by some cattle losses and a pending water rights dispute, both of which are being addressed. The underlying asset value of the property is substantial. I would like to discuss a 6-month extension on the note at the current rate, with a partial payment of $300 against the principal at signing. Alderman pulled the documents toward him and began to read. Eleanor sat very still and let him read. She had learned a very long time ago that sitting still while a man read your documents was considerably more effective than explaining them, because men who read things themselves were more likely to believe them than men who were told about them, and this truth held regardless of the century or the location or the specific man. He read for 20 minutes. He asked 4 questions, all of which she answered precisely. He touched his watch chain twice more. Then he said, "I'll need to consult with the board, of course, but I think we can accommodate a 6-month extension. The partial payment helps." "I have a draft for the 300, she said, and produced it from her satchel. He looked at the draft, he looked at her, and then in the voice of a man who has revised his initial assessment and is willing to say so without making a production of it, "Henry Blackstone was a fortunate man, Mrs. Price." "He was a practical man," she said. "Those often amount to the same thing." She stood up and offered her hand, which he shook with slightly more respect than he had extended to her when she'd come in. "I'll wait for your board's confirmation. Good afternoon, Mr. Alderman." She took the 1 o'clock train back to Harlan's Fork and was home before dark. Just, Luke was waiting for her when she came in. Not in the kitchen, he was in the hallway, which was unusual, and he had his coat on, which suggested he had been outside recently and come back. And the expression on his face was the particular carefully controlled expression of a man who has learned something significant and is sorting through the implications. "Sit down," he said. "I just got off the train," she said. "I know. Sit down, Eleanor." She sat down because he had called her Eleanor rather than Mrs. Price, which he had never done before, and that was worth paying attention to. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. He had the old ledger, the 1864 to 1873 ledger in front of him, and beside it was a sheaf of other papers she did not immediately recognize. He had been back in the foreman's office, she could see from the order of things. "I went through everything," he said. "All the ledgers, all the way back. And I found—" He paused. He organized the papers with the careful attention of a man who wants to say something important accurately and does not want to get it wrong. "In 1870, there was a note against the ranch with a private lender in Miles City, $1,500. It was due in 1871, and there's no record of the family paying it." He pushed one of the papers toward her. "But it was cleared. The lien was released. I found the release document in the back of the 1871 ledger." Eleanor looked at the paper. She knew what it said. She had been present for the signing of it. "The private lender's name is listed as E.G. Randall Trust," Luke said, "which is my husband's estate," she said. "James held a small trust from his grandfather. I had access to it as the surviving spouse." She looked up from the paper. The trust was exhausted by the following year. Luke was very quiet. He laid his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her. $1,500, he said. "The drought of 1870 was nearly as bad as 1864, she said, and the cattle prices had been poor for 3 years running. Your father was facing foreclosure." She paused. "He didn't know about the trust. I hadn't told him. When I understood the situation, I renegotiated the terms. From a private Miles City lender, who had agreed to take the note from the original holder at a discount," she said. "I had been corresponding with the lender on your father's behalf for 6 months at that point. I knew his position." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "You bought the note." "I converted it," she said carefully, "into a trust arrangement, which was then satisfied over the following year by certain mechanisms that are recorded in the ledger if you look at the entries for 1871. "Certain mechanisms," he said in a tone that suggested he had already looked at the 1871 entries and had his own reading of what they meant. "The 1871 calf season was better," she said, "and some of the horse stock sold well at the Miles City market. Eleanor," he said her name with a patience that was not quite impatience but was heading in that direction, "you spent your inheritance and your husband's trust to keep this ranch from foreclosure. Twice. The ranch kept this ranch from foreclosure," she said. "Both times I simply provided the capital at the critical moment." "Arrange for the capital to be available," she said, "which is a different thing." He was quiet again. She could hear the wind outside and the distant settling sounds of the house, and further off the horses moving in the barn. My father knew, Luke said. He knew what you did. He knew eventually, she said. Not immediately. I was careful about immediacy. Why? She looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could hear that in it, and it deserved a genuine answer, and she had been giving genuine answers to Luke Blackstone's questions for 3 weeks now, which was more genuine answers than she had given anyone in approximately 20 years. Because a man who is grateful is a different problem than a man who is indebted, she said. Gratitude is manageable. Indebtedness creates resentment. I needed your father to continue managing this ranch effectively, and he could not do that if he felt diminished every time he looked at me. She paused. And I needed the work. This was my home. Luke looked at her for a moment longer than he usually let himself look at her. Is that all it was? He said. The work. She stood up from the table. I'll make dinner, she said. The supply order came in today, and there's a good cut of beef that should be used tonight. Eleanor. It's a complicated question, she said, and I'd rather answer it when I'm not tired from the train. She moved to the stove. Did the Billings Bank respond? She heard him breathe slowly in and out, and then she heard him close the ledger and stack the papers. Not yet, he said. But Finch came by. The Hatcher water situation is more complicated than we thought. She turned. How so? The Hatchers have sold to a land holding company incorporated in Chicago. It happened 3 weeks ago and was just now recorded at the county office. He looked at her. The holding company has connections to the Montana Land Syndicate. Eleanor set down the spoon she was holding. She thought through the implications with the particular focused clarity that she brought to problems that required it. If the syndicate owns the Hatcher property, she said they own the outstanding water rights claim. Yes, and if they push that claim aggressively while the inheritance contest is active, they can create enough legal uncertainty about the ranch's situation to make financing very difficult. He paused, and land acquisition very attractive. She picked up the spoon again. She set a pot on the stove. Does Richard know? I told him an hour ago. How did he take it? He took it the way Richard takes things that frighten him, Luke said, loudly and with attribution to other people. Did he attribute it to me? Not this time, Luke said, and she could hear in the slight change in his voice that he had said something he found sardonic but was choosing not to pursue. He blamed Father for not selling to the syndicate when they first approached him 2 years ago. Henry wouldn't sell. No. Henry built this ranch, Eleanor said. She said it simply the way she would have stated a fact about the weather. He wouldn't have sold it for any price. I know. Luke was quiet for a moment. I know he wouldn't. He paused and then he said, he talked about you, when I would visit these last few years. Eleanor kept her attention on the stove. Not, he wasn't sentimental about it, Luke said. He didn't say much, he would just mention things. That Mrs. Price had handled the Hargreaves dispute, that Mrs. Price had found a better price for the winter feed, that Mrs. Price had talked Patterson into holding the rent on the storage building another season. A pause. He said it the way you'd talk about someone you worked alongside, a partner. She took a careful breath. Your father and I understood each other, she said. We didn't always agree, but we understood each other. Did you? He stopped himself. She turned to look at him because the pause had a particular quality that she thought deserved her attention. I'm sorry, he said. That's not my question to ask. What were you going to ask? He looked at her steadily. Did you love him? The question was not prurient. She could hear that clearly. It was a serious question from a man trying to understand the 30-year architecture of a relationship he'd only seen from the outside. She considered the answer with the same care she brought to everything that mattered. I loved him the way you love a country you've lived in your whole adult life, she said. The kind of love that comes from knowing a place's seasons and its difficult roads and its good years and its bad ones. Not a romantic love, but not a simple one either. She paused. And he was good to me in his way, in the way he knew how to be. Luke nodded slowly. He did not say anything which she appreciated. There were men who would have pushed for a more legible version, and Luke Blackstone had never been that kind of man. The syndicate, she said. We need Finch to look at the Hatcher water claim, specifically whether the sale to the holding company was recorded properly and whether any claims outstanding at the time of sale require separate reestablishment. That's what I thought, he said. I've already sent word to Finch. Good. She turned back to the stove. And we should get Tillis to survey the north fence line. All of it. If someone cut it once, they may try it again. Already done, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the last light of the afternoon with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She hadn't noticed him pour. And he looked, she searched for the right word and found it: competent. That was the word. Not just capable in the general way of men who had done hard work, but competent in the specific way of someone who understood what the problems were and had begun methodically to address them. "You're not going back to your place," she said. "Not yet," he said. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the last of the March light was going down behind the mountains, and the kitchen was warm from the fire and the smell of the beef in the pot. And Eleanor Price, who had spent 30 years keeping other people's households in order, felt for just the length of time it takes to stir a pot. Something that was not precisely peace, but was in the same general direction. Aptasem. Word from Billings came on a Friday. Alderman's board had approved the 6-month extension at the original rate subject to the partial payment, which Finch's office confirmed receipt of. Eleanor wrote Alderman a formal acknowledgement and filed her copy in the ranch correspondence cabinet. She added a note in the current ledger banknote extended 6 months to September 14, 1894. Partial payment $300 applied. Balance $1,420. It was a clean line. She liked clean lines. They meant the next person who read the ledger would understand exactly where things stood. The following Monday, Finch sent a letter regarding the Hatcher water claim. The sale to the Chicago Holding Company had been recorded, but the water rights claim, which had been filed 3 years earlier in a separate legal proceeding, had not been properly transferred. Finch's reading, shared with a colleague in Miles City, who specialized in territorial water law, was that the claim would need to be refiled by the new owners before it had legal standing. That process would take a minimum of 60 days and required a formal surveying of the boundaries, which would need to be scheduled. 60 days, Luke said when Eleanor showed him the letter. Give or take, she said. Long enough for us to get through calving and have the spring numbers settled. She paused. And long enough for the will contest to make some progress one way or another. Richard had been notably quieter since the second letter reading. His attorney Greaves had not been back to the ranch. Caroline, who had been in Harlan's Fork for the past 10 days visiting an acquaintance, had come back with the particular careful composure of a woman who has been thinking. I had a conversation with Caroline, Luke said, last night. Oh, she wants to propose a compromise on the will. He paused. She's not willing to give up the contest entirely because she thinks Richard won't agree to that, and she needs to stay on the right side of Richard for now. But she said she's prepared to recommend against aggressive litigation, to advocate for a settlement. Eleanor looked at the letter in her hands. What kind of settlement? She didn't specify. I think she wants to see how Richard moves first. Richard is going to move the way money moves, Eleanor said, which is toward the path of least resistance. She folded the letter and set it on the desk. The syndicate is the real problem. If they get the Hatcher claim refiled and start putting pressure on the water, and if there's a poor spring market. She stopped. You've been thinking about this, he said. I'm always thinking about it, she said. That's the job. He looked at her for a moment. When did you last take a day off from the job? She considered the question as she would consider any reasonable question with attention. I don't recall exactly, she said. I went to the county fair in October. Does that count? Did you work while you were there? I bought supplies for the winter pantry. That's work. It was also pleasant, she said. The weather was good. He made a sound that she had started to recognize as his version of a laugh, a brief, compressed exhalation, amused but controlled. After calving, he said, after all of this settles a little, I'm going to take you out to see the South Range when the wildflowers come up. There's a ridge above the creek that... He stopped himself. He cleared his throat. It's a good piece of land. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall at a point somewhere to the left of her head with the particular careful attention of a man who has said something more personal than he intended and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. I'd like that, she said. Thank you. He nodded once and looked at the desk and picked up the letter she had set down as though he needed something to hold. I'll send this to Finch, he said. I already filed a copy, she said. There's one for Finch in the correspondence tray. He found it. He put his hat on. He left. Eleanor looked at the correspondence tray for a moment, and then she looked at the window, and then she went back to work. Vasha. The spring calving began in earnest in the third week of March and ran through the middle of April. And during those 4 weeks, the entire ranch existed in a state of focused, exhausted, pragmatic attention that left very little room for anything else. Eleanor was up before dawn every morning and in bed late every night, managing the logistics of feeding crews who were working in shifts, arranging for the veterinarian from Harlan's Fork to be available twice a week, keeping track of numbers in the current ledger, as each day's calf count came in from Tillis. The count was better than expected. Not good, not the numbers of a boom year, nothing like the records of the late 1870s, but better than the previous 3 years, better than the preliminary projections had suggested. By the end of March, Eleanor had revised her summer market estimate upward by enough to matter. Luke worked alongside the ranch hands through the calving season. He was up as early as Eleanor and out as late as the night crew, and he had a particular competence with cattle that she had not known about or had forgotten, or perhaps never had reason to notice, that made the men accept him without the resistance they might otherwise have extended to a ranch owner's son who had been gone for years. He ate his meals in the kitchen at the table, and occasionally they sat across from each other in the 10 minutes between one task and another with coffee going cold between them, and they talked about the ranch, the numbers, the fence that had been strengthened along the north boundary, the horses that needed shoeing, the bunkhouse roof that had developed a new leak over the winter. Sometimes they did not talk at all, and that was also fine in the way that silences are fine between people who have been working alongside each other long enough to understand each other's rhythms. One evening near the end of March, when the calf count for the day was recorded, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Aldridge had gone to her room, Luke was sitting at the kitchen table going through the survey maps that Finch had sent, the boundary maps relevant to the water rights dispute, and Eleanor was at the stove putting together what she intended to be a simple supper of eggs and bread. "You're going to want to look at this section," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. She came around the table and stood behind him, looking over his shoulder. He was pointing to the northeast corner of the Hatcher property, the section of boundary that was closest to the Blackstone North pasture, the same section where the fence had been cut. "That's where the original water claim was filed," she said, the Eastern Creek branch. "There's a notation here." He tilted the map toward the lamp. "A survey note from 1887. It looks like the original survey was done by a Billings company, but there's a dispute notation in the margin." Eleanor looked at the notation. She had not seen this particular map before it had come with Finch's package last week, and she had not yet gone through all the attachments. She leaned closer. "That's Henry's handwriting," she said. Luke looked at her. "The notation," she said. "Henry made it. Look at the numeral 7. She pointed. "He always made his 7s with a crossbar the European way. His schoolmaster as a child, I think." She straightened up. "He was disputing the survey." Luke turned the map toward himself and read the notation more carefully. "He says the original survey line was 40 feet off the true boundary. That the creek branch in question, the east branch, actually lies within Blackstone property, not Hatcher." "If that's true," Eleanor said, "then the water rights claim is built on a faulty survey." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. "If we could have the boundary resurveyed by an independent party, that would take time," he said. "And if the syndicate files the claim during the survey, we request to stay on the claim pending the survey," she said. "Finch would know the procedure." She paused. "When was this map made?" "Filed with the county in 1889. Henry filed a dispute notation with the county in 1889. It's in the margin of the county copy," Luke said, "which means it was made on the original." Eleanor thought about that. Henry had known. He had known about the survey discrepancy, had documented it, and had not pushed it forward. Which was the kind of thing Henry did when he wanted something in reserve. Not aggressive by nature, Henry Blackstone strategic. He had kept the notation quiet, available exactly where it needed to be when it was needed. "He left us a key," she said. Luke looked up at her. He was half-turned in his chair, tilting up to look at her, and the lamplight was at the angle that caught the line of his jaw and the dark of his eyes. And there was a moment, the particular kind of moment she had learned to manage carefully since the will reading. Since all of this, where the distance between them felt like something other than professional space. She stepped back to the stove. "I'll write to Finch tomorrow," she said. "First thing." "Eleanor." His voice stopped her again. She had begun to notice that his voice stopped her more consistently than anyone else's. "What are you going to do after all this is settled?" She looked at him. He had turned fully in his chair. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean the will, the contest, the syndicate, when it's settled one way or another." He paused. "Are you going to stay?" "This is my home," she said. "I know it's your home. I mean—" He stopped. He looked at his hands on the map. "I mean, what do you want? Not what the ranch needs. What do you want?" She stood very still at the stove. Outside, the spring wind moved through the new grass in the south pasture, and the lamp guttered once and steadied, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted and settled. "I've wanted the same thing for 30 years, she said. "To be here, to see it go on." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded, and he looked back at the map, and she turned back to the eggs, and neither of them said anything more that evening, and neither of them needed to. Chapter April in the Montana Territory had a way of testing your patience before rewarding it. The cold returned in the third week of the month, a hard frost that came down from the north without the decency of a warning, and the first calf losses of the spring arrived with it. Eleanor sat with Tillis in the foreman's office for 2 hours that morning, going through the numbers, and the numbers were not catastrophic, but they were not good. And the conversation was the particular kind of conversation that both of them conducted in the manner of people who have had variations of it before and have learned that the most useful thing you can do with bad news is understand it accurately before you try to address it. 4 calves lost in the north pasture where the shelter was insufficient for the unexpected cold. 1 more in the east field that had been born weak and probably would not have made it regardless. The spring herd count was now revised downward by a number that meant the summer market projections needed adjustment. The shelter in the north pasture, Eleanor said. It was on the repair list for 3 years. It was. Tillis agreed without accusation. He was not an accusatory man. He was a precise one, which she had always appreciated. Add it to the immediate repair schedule, she said, before we lose anything else to weather. She looked at the figures. I'll adjust the projections for Finch. The syndicate is still in town, Tillis said. Whitmore and his attorneys. They've been at the hotel 4 days. I know. They've been talking to people, Gartner and 2 others. She looked up. What kind of talking? The kind that's about what Blackstone Ranch would be worth if it came to market. He paused. Gartner isn't interested. I don't know about the others. Eleanor closed the ledger. She sat back in the chair and looked at the wall for a moment, not because the wall had anything useful on it, but because looking at a neutral surface was how she thought clearly without the distraction of other people's expressions. The syndicate gathering information from neighboring ranchers was a standard approach. They were building a picture of the property's value and vulnerability. The calf losses would matter if they could find out about them, and in a small community like Harlan's Fork, information traveled. Someone at the livery stable, someone at the feed store, someone who had seen the Blackstone hands bringing the dead calves out of the north pasture on a cold morning, the information was available to anyone who wanted to collect it. Ben, she said, when was the last time the ranch had a bad spring? He thought about it. 1889, he said. The late freeze, we lost 8 head. And before that, 1883, the wet spring, we lost a couple dozen to bloat. And the ranch survived both. Clearly, he said, yes? The syndicate knows that, she said. They're not looking for catastrophic failure. They're looking for the accumulation of smaller problems that make selling look like a reasonable option. She stood up. We don't sell. We repair the north pasture shelter, and we adjust the projections, and we run the summer market, and we survive. She picked up the ledger. That's what this ranch does. Tillis looked at her with the slightly recalibrated expression she had been collecting from him all spring, not quite surprise, not quite admiration, something between them. Yes, ma'am, he said in a tone that was not reflexive deference but something more deliberate. Thank you, Ben, she said. She went back to the house. Bah! The church social in May was the first one Eleanor attended as something other than a woman at the edge of the gathering. It was not she understood that the town had become entirely reconciled to the situation. Small towns were never entirely reconciled to things that disrupted their sense of order, and Eleanor Price's situation had disrupted a great deal of order. But the specific flavor of the disruption had changed from scandal to something more complicated and less straightforward to condemn. And in that space of complication, she found that Saturday afternoon that several women wanted to speak with her who had not spoken with her before. A woman named Addie Hargreaves, whose husband ran the grain merchant's business, came and sat beside Eleanor at one of the long tables set up in the churchyard and said without preamble, "My girls need good examples, real ones, not the ones in books." She looked at Eleanor directly with the frank evaluation of a woman who does not have time for indirection. Would you be willing to come and speak to the Women's Society about running a business? About managing a ranch, Eleanor said. Is there a difference? Eleanor thought about that. In the principles, very little, she said. In the specific details, a great deal. But I'd be glad to come. Next month, Addie said, first Thursday. Eleanor said yes. She had never been asked to speak at anything in 30 years, and she was surprised to find that she wanted to go and that she had things she wanted to say that were not only about ranching. She thought about accuracy in documents and the particular professional discipline of knowing the difference between what a problem looks like from the outside and what it actually is. She thought she might have things to say about all of those. Two younger women in their 30s with the look of women who were building households and wanted to do it correctly came to her with questions about household account management, and she spent 20 minutes at the church social explaining the principles of a double-entry system, which they received with the focused attention of people hearing something useful. One of them, a woman named Ruth Pemberton, took notes on the back of the church program. That pleased Eleanor more than she expected it to. By the time the social ended in the early evening, she had made 3 specific commitments: the Women's Society speaking engagement, an agreement to review the church's household donation records for the quarterly account, and a promise to share her recipe for the brown bread that she had brought to the social and which had been consumed entirely within the first hour. She walked home to Blackstone Ranch in the long light of the May evening, feeling she searched for the word useful. Not in the invisible, unremarked upon way she had been useful for 30 years, but in the straightforward, acknowledged way of someone whose usefulness is recognized and welcome. It was a different feeling than she was accustomed to. It was not uncomfortable. She told Luke about the Women's Society engagement at dinner, and he listened with the attention he gave everything she said, and when she was done, he said, "What are you going to tell them?" She thought about it. "The truth," she said, which is that the most important part of managing anything is knowing the actual state of it. Not the state you wish it were in. Not the state that is easiest to report. The true state. She paused. Everything else follows from that. Luke was quiet for a moment. Henry knew the true state, he said. Eventually. Henry always knew the true state of the cattle and the land and the labor, she said. It was the accounts he sometimes wanted to not look at. A pause. Most people have something they would prefer not to look at. "What's yours?" he said. She looked at him across the table in the evening kitchen, with the last of the May light coming through the window and the lamp on the table between them. "I'd prefer not to think about the first 5 years," she said. "After James, before I had made this place what I needed it to be." She said it simply without drama. "That was a hard time. I got through it because working hard enough leaves very little room for other things. But I don't look back at it willingly." Luke nodded. He did not ask for more, which she appreciated. "And now," he said. She looked at the window. Outside, the May evening was doing something soft and blue, with the light over the south pasture and the mountains in the distance, had that clean-edged look they got when the air was clear and still. "Now is considerably better," she said. He filled her coffee cup, which was empty, and he filled his own, and they sat in the kitchen in the good quiet of a May evening, with the ranch going about its business outside, and the lamp on the table between them, and that was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the specific kind of enough that most people spend their whole lives looking for without knowing that is what they are looking for. Chatats. Spring moved through the valley the way it always did in Montana, in fits and starts, 2 days of warmth followed by a hard night of frost, the mountains holding their snow longer than the flatlands, and releasing it slowly into the creeks that fed the pastures. By the first week of April, the south and east pastures were green enough to move the cattle from the supplemental hay, which was a relief to the ranch's feed accounts. Finch's response to Eleanor's letter about the survey notation arrived on a Wednesday. He wrote consulted with a colleague who practiced territorial land law, and the situation was in his considered opinion more advantageous than it initially appeared. The survey notation in Henry's hand filed as a county document addendum in 1889, and therefore part of the public record, constituted a formal dispute of the original survey. Under territorial law, a disputed survey could be grounds for staying any legal claim that relied on the disputed line until an independent resurvey was conducted. He had already prepared the necessary filing and would present it at the territorial court within the week, pending Eleanor's authorization. She authorized it. She wrote back the same day in the careful hand that aldermen had recognized after 20 years of reading it across a bank desk. The filing was made the following Friday. Finch sent word that the territorial court had scheduled the resurvey for May 6 weeks out, and that any water rights claim filed in the interim would be automatically stayed pending the survey results. The syndicate would know this. Finch thought they would not find it useful to file the claim before the survey because a claim filed under a disputed survey was a claim they might have to refile at considerable expense. The practical result was that the syndicate had lost 2 months of legal leverage at minimum. "Good," Luke said when she showed him Finch's letter. "It buys time," she said. "It doesn't resolve the underlying situation." "Time is what we needed." He set the letter down. Richard has been talking to his attorney. Greaves came back yesterday. I know. I saw his horse in the yard. He's going to push for a mediated settlement. Through the court. He looked at her. Greaves thinks Richard thinks that the second letter weakens the contest on the grounds of testamentary incapacity, so they're shifting to a different argument. What argument? Undue influence. Luke's voice was carefully level in the way it was when he was saying something he found distasteful. Specifically the argument that a person in a position of authority over a vulnerable elderly person providing essential care and services constitutes a form of structural coercion. He paused. It's not a new argument. It's been used before. Eleanor looked at the wall. And how strong is it? Finch thinks it's weak. Given the documented evidence, the letters, the argument would be that you spent 30 years systematically manipulating a man with money, which is difficult to square with the documented fact that you spent 30 years giving that man money. He paused again. But it would be an argument made in court in public, and even a losing argument costs. She understood what he was not saying. A court proceeding would be expensive, prolonged, and public. It would involve testifying to things she had kept private for 30 years. It would give the syndicate more time to consolidate their position, and it would cost the ranch money it did not have to spare. There is another option, she said. He looked at her. I could negotiate directly with Richard, she said. Not through attorneys, not through the court. She turned to face him. The house Henry left me the house. Richard doesn't want the house as a building. He wants the symbolic claim. He wants to be able to say that the family home belongs to the family. The house is the largest single asset. I know what it's worth, she said. I also know that I have never needed a house. I have needed a room and a place to work and the means to keep this ranch running. She paused. If I offered Richard a fair market lease arrangement for the house structured so that the family retains the right to use it, but the legal ownership remains with the estate provision, it might be enough to make the court contest look less attractive. Luke was quiet for a long time. She could see him weighing it the way he weighed everything carefully without rushing to a conclusion. You'd give up the house, he said. I'd lease it, she corrected, with appropriate terms. It's still giving up the primary asset. The primary asset is the ranch, she said. The land, the cattle, the water, the house is a house. She paused. I have never cared about the house for itself. Henry knew that. Did he? Henry knew that I cared about the ranch going on, she said. That's what he was protecting, not my right to a particular building. She looked at the window. I think sometimes men and women care about different things when it comes to what a home means. Henry understood what I meant by home. Luke said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be familiar with and which she continued to find difficult to categorize. It was not quite the way you looked at someone you were fond of, and not quite the way you looked at someone you admired, and not quite either of those things separately. And she had been careful not to spend too much time trying to categorize it. Let me talk to Richard, he said. Before you approach him, let me see where he actually stands. Luke, I know you can manage Richard yourself, he said in a tone that was not impatient, just clear. I'm not suggesting you can't. I'm suggesting that the conversation might go better if it starts with me, because Richard is never going to voluntarily approach you without his back against a wall, and if his back is against a wall, he won't think clearly. She considered this. It was a fair analysis. Richard, like most men who led with authority, made worse decisions under direct pressure than under the appearance of control. A brother-to-brother conversation was less threatening than a confrontation with the woman he had spent 2 months dismissing. All right, she said, but I want to be present for whatever comes next. You will be, he said. Cha-cha. Luke and Richard had their conversation on a Thursday evening in the study. Eleanor knew they were talking because she had deliberately arranged to be in the kitchen, which shared a wall with the study, and through which, on the other side of a thick plaster partition, the sound of male voices was a dim and unintelligible rumble. She could not hear the words. She could hear the rhythm of the conversation, Richard's shorter, louder contributions, Luke's longer and quieter ones, and she could hear, after approximately 40 minutes, a marked change in the tempo that suggested something had shifted. She made a pot of coffee and set it on the tray, and when she heard the study door open, she was already in the hallway ready to bring it in. Richard looked at her when she came through the study door with the coffee tray, and she looked at him, and the expression on his face was not what she had expected. It was not the belligerence she had been bracing for. It was not the barely contained resentment of the past 2 months. It was something more complicated, and she thought more honest. Mrs. Price, he said, sit down. She sat down, setting the coffee tray on the desk. Luke tells me Richard said that you're considering a lease arrangement on the house. I'm considering whether such an arrangement might satisfy the core concern of the contest, she said, while preserving the ranch's operational stability. Richard made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. He picked up his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands. Father left you the house, he said. You know that. You have the legal right to it. I know my legal position, she said. Then why? Because my legal position is not the only consideration, she said. I've been managing this ranch for 30 years with the understanding that the family's interests and the ranch's interests are generally the same thing. If they're currently in tension, I'd rather find a way to align them than win a court argument. Richard looked at her for a long moment. He had the Blackstone eyes, the same dark brown as Luke's, and as Henry's had been, though in Richard, they sat differently under heavier brows, with less of the quietness and more of the calculation. He was, she thought, not a bad man. He was a proud man and a greedy man, and a man who had spent his whole life understanding himself to be the heir to something significant, and was now reckoning with how complicated that inheritance actually was. The ledgers, he said. What you put in. He stopped. He set down the cup. I did the math. So you said at the reading, she said. I did the math again last night, he said, looking at all the ledger entries Finch outlined. Not just the money, the labor resolution, the payroll, the water rights. He paused. I don't have a good framework for what you did. I did what needed doing, she said. That's all. That's not all, he said with a directness she had not expected from him. Doing what needs doing when it costs you your own money and your own future, and you tell nobody about it and you don't ask for anything in return, that's not just doing what needs doing, that's... He stopped again. I don't have a word for it. Loyalty, Luke said quietly from the chair by the window. Richard looked at his brother, then he looked at Eleanor. It's more than loyalty, he said. Eleanor did not say anything because she genuinely did not have a response, and she had learned long ago that the times when you genuinely had no response were the times to remain quiet and let the moment settle. I'm going to withdraw the contest, Richard said. On one condition. She waited. The condition is that you agree to a formal advisory role for the family in major operational decisions. Not a veto, just consultation. The family gets to be at the table. She looked at him steadily. That was always the intention, she said. I'm managing a ranch that the family owns. Of course we consult. He blinked. It's that simple. It was always that simple, she said. The will gave me authority to manage operations. It did not give me authority to exclude the family from knowledge of what's happening to their inheritance. Richard sat back in his chair. He rubbed his face with both hands in the gesture of a man releasing something he has been holding for a long time. Greaves is going to be furious, he said. Greaves will bill you for his time regardless, she said. His feelings about the outcome are secondary. Something like a smile crossed Richard Blackstone's face, a reluctant, self-aware smile, the kind that emerges when a man recognizes something about himself he would rather not recognize. It made him look for a moment more like Luke than she had ever seen him look. You are, he said, a formidable woman, Mrs. Price. I'm a thorough one, she said, which tends to produce similar results. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it within his reach. Will you speak with Caroline, or shall I? I'll speak with Caroline, he said, and she could hear in his voice that he would and that he meant it, and that whatever conversation he had with his sister would be different from the ones that had preceded this one. Data. The town began to turn in the way towns turn when the balance of evidence shifts not all at once, and not without residual skepticism, but definitely and measurably. The publication of the second letter which Finch had made available to the county clerk per Henry's specific instruction meant that the documented facts of Eleanor's contributions to Blackstone Ranch were now a matter of public record. People read them. Some people read them twice. The Reverend at the Methodist Church, the same church where Eleanor had been sitting in the second-to-last pew for years, preached a sermon in early April about stewardship and faithfulness that was without naming Eleanor directly quite clearly about Eleanor. Afterward, two women who had crossed the street to avoid her in February came and shook her hand, and old Patterson at the livery stable looked her in the eye and said, "Heard the whole thing, Mrs. Price? Good for you," which was considerably more than she had expected, and about as much as she could manage without becoming something other than composed. She managed anyway. In the third week of April, a delegation from the Montana Land Syndicate arrived in Harlan's Fork. There were three of them, two attorneys, and a man in a good suit who introduced himself as the syndicate's regional director. They set up in the hotel on Main Street and sent a formal letter to Blackstone Ranch requesting a meeting to discuss a possible purchase of the property. Eleanor and Luke and Finch sat at the kitchen table and read the letter. "They're moving," Luke said. "They're testing," Eleanor said. "A purchase inquiry before the water survey is a test. They want to know if the family will fragment under pressure." "And will it?" Finch said with the professional delicacy of a man who needed to know but preferred the answer to come from someone else. "No," Eleanor said. She said it simply without drama in the voice she used when she had already resolved a question and was no longer interested in debating it, and Finch nodded and made a note and seemed satisfied. "What about Richard?" Luke said. "Richard withdrew the contest yesterday," Eleanor said. "He'll be at the meeting." Luke looked at her. "He withdrew, you saw him yesterday." "We spoke at length," she said. "He has questions about the spring market and the summer projections. He'd like to be more engaged in the financial planning." She paused. "I think that's a reasonable request." Luke was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she recognized now as the kind of attention he gave things that surprised him without quite surprising him, if that made sense, which she thought it might. "You made a deal with Richard," he said. "I had a conversation with Richard," she said carefully, "in which we arrived at a mutual understanding." She looked at Finch. "Can we respond to the syndicate delegation by Friday?" "We can respond tomorrow," Finch said with the brief, satisfied efficiency of a man who enjoys being useful. "Friday will do," Eleanor said. "It gives us time to prepare the response properly." Man. The meeting with the syndicate took place on a Thursday afternoon in the parlor at Blackstone Ranch. The three Blackstone siblings were present, Richard on one side of the room with his arms crossed, Caroline on the other with her hands folded, Luke at the desk with the ranch documents arranged in front of him. Eleanor sat beside Luke with her own set of the relevant papers. Finch sat at the end of the desk in his professional capacity. The syndicate's regional director, his name was Whitmore, was a man of 40 who wore his confidence like a good coat and had the particular practiced charm of someone who has bought and sold other people's property for long enough to find the transaction entirely uncomplicated. He presented the syndicate's offer a purchase price that was, Eleanor noted, approximately 70% of current market value. She noted this on her paper without comment and waited for him to finish. "We understand the ranch is currently in a transitional period," Whitmore said with a sympathy that was perfectly calibrated and entirely insincere. "A family situation of this kind can be very taxing. We want to offer a straightforward, clean solution." "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said in the moment that followed before anyone else could speak, "what is your current offer for the Hatcher property, the one you purchased through the holding company in January?" Whitmore looked at her. He was recalibrating, she could see it, and he did it quickly, which suggested he was competent, which she had expected. "I'm not certain that's relevant to the present. You paid $4,200 for a property assessed at $6,800, she said. A transaction made possible because the Hatcher family was in financial difficulty following 2 years of legal fees on a water rights claim. A water rights claim that, as of last week's filing, is stayed pending a survey that my attorney," she nodded toward Finch, "believes will show the claim to be built on a faulty original survey." She paused. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not suggesting any impropriety. I'm establishing that we are familiar with your approach, which is to identify properties under pressure and make offers at favorable discounts. We are not a property under pressure. We have resolved our family matter and our financial obligations and our legal disputes. We are not interested in selling." Whitmore looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Richard, then at Luke. He appeared to be seeking confirmation that the woman at the desk was speaking for the family and not only for herself. Richard, without shifting his posture, arms still crossed expression, still careful, said, "You heard Mrs. Price." Whitmore looked back at Eleanor. "If the situation changes," he said smoothly, "we hope you'll remember us." "We'll remember you," she said. "I keep thorough records." He took the point. He gathered his papers and his attorneys gathered theirs, and they left without the argument or the counter-argument or the escalated pressure that she had been prepared for, because the foundation for that pressure, the contested will, the outstanding banknote, the water rights claim, the family division, was no longer there. The parlor was very quiet for a moment after they left. Then Richard Blackstone let out a breath that he appeared to have been holding for approximately 30 minutes, and he said, "All right, show me the summer market projections." And Eleanor opened the top page of her stack of documents and began to show him. The survey was conducted on a warm day in the first week of May by 2 independent surveyors from Miles City who worked with the efficiency of men who had been asked to do a specific job and were not interested in anything beyond its completion. They spent the better part of a day walking the north boundary of the Blackstone property and the former Hatcher, now the Syndicate Holding Company's property, with their instruments and their chain measures and their careful attention to the landmarks that Henry had notated in his 1889 filing. Their finding confirmed Henry's notation. The East Creek branch lay entirely within Blackstone property. The original 1887 survey had placed the boundary line 41 feet east of its correct position, giving the Hatcher property, and now the Syndicate, a claim to a water source they were not legally entitled to. Finch filed the survey results with the territorial court. The water rights claim was dismissed. The Syndicate received notice, and the Syndicate, which was at the end of the day a business operation and not a personal grudge, moved on to the next opportunity. Whitmore was not seen in Harlan's Fork again. The cattle market that summer was, if not spectacular, respectable. The calf numbers from the spring were better than projected. The note with Billings Territorial Savings was on a 6-month extension that would come due in September, and by July, Eleanor's calculations suggested that the ranch would be able to make a substantial payment against the principal, with the remaining balance manageable through the following year's operations. She put those numbers in the ledger with the clean lines she preferred. One afternoon in June, she was working at the study desk when she heard Richard's voice in the hallway speaking to one of the housemaids, and then the sound of him going into the kitchen, and then a few minutes later the particular domestic sound of a cabinet opening and closing that meant he was looking for something. She went to the kitchen doorway. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at the cabinet above the stove, with the helpless expression of a man who has never learned where the coffee is kept in someone else's kitchen. "Second shelf," she said, "left side." He found it. He got the coffee things together with the clumsy efficiency of a man who made coffee at home, but differently. She watched him for a moment, and then, because it was quicker and she was standing there, she took the kettle from him and put it on the stove herself. "I'm going back to Billings next week," he said. "Constance needs me home." "Of course," she said. "I'll be back before the September market." He paused. "I'd like to be here for the financial review before the market, if that works." "That works," she said. He nodded. He stood beside the stove while she managed the kettle, and the kitchen was quiet in the summer way, warm smelling of yesterday's bread and the dried herbs she kept on the windowsill. And it occurred to Eleanor that this was the first time she had been in the same room with Richard Blackstone without either of them being guarded. "Father would have told you," Richard said abruptly, "eventually, what he was going to do with the will." "I'm not certain of that," she said. "I am." He turned to lean against the counter with his arms crossed, looking at the window. "He talked about you the last time I was here. Not about the will specifically, but about—" He stopped. "He said you were the best ranch manager he'd ever worked alongside, and that he'd been too proud to say so while you were both in good health." He paused. He said it in the way of a man who was working up to a larger admission that he didn't quite get to. Eleanor poured the coffee. She handed him a cup. She was quiet for a moment. "He did say it," she said, "once in the last months." She looked at the window. "He said he was sorry he hadn't made things clearer sooner." She paused. "I told him it was fine, because it was. We understood each other." Richard looked at his coffee. "Did he know how you felt?" He said it carefully, without prying. It was a different kind of question from the one Luke had asked, more practical in its framing, less interested in the emotional texture. "He knew what I needed," she said. "This ranch, a place, to be useful." She paused. "Whether that constitutes feelings I leave to other people to judge." Richard made a sound that was, she was almost certain, a genuine laugh. Brief, unpracticed, as though it had emerged without his explicit approval. "God," he said, "you sound exactly like him." Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time since the funeral, she felt something warm pass between them. Not quite affection, not yet, but the preliminary to it. The thing that exists in the moment before two people decide they might be all right with each other after all. "Drink your coffee," she said. He did. "Chawsome." In the third week of April, the town of Harlan's Fork experienced the particular collective phenomenon that occurred whenever a local matter resolved in a way that the consensus story had not accounted for. The consensus story, the one that had been circulating since February, held that Eleanor Price had manipulated a dying man for personal gain, and that the Blackstone family was the rightful and aggrieved victim. This story had the clarity and the moral simplicity that rumors prefer, and it had circulated efficiently precisely because it was simple. The documented facts were considerably more complex, and they arrived gradually in pieces, each piece complicating the consensus story a little more than the last. The county filing of the second letter, the public record of the 1864 ledger entry, The news passed from the bank to the feed merchant to the dry goods store in the way that financial news moves in small communities that Eleanor Price had gone to Billings and renegotiated the ranch note without an attorney. The survey filing, the syndicate delegation's departure from the hotel. By late April, the consensus story had become a different story. It was not a simple story. The facts didn't allow for a simple story, but it was a more accurate one. An accuracy Eleanor had always believed was worth the complication. She knew the story was changing when old Joe Patterson at the livery stable began offering her unsolicited opinions about horse feed prices again, which he had done for years before February and had stopped after the will reading. The offer of unsolicited opinions on horse feed prices was in the particular social register of Harlan's Fork, the equivalent of an official welcome back to the community of people whose views were worth consulting. She thanked him for the information about the feed prices, which was genuinely useful, because the winter had driven costs up across the territory, and she needed to revise the spring feed budget. She also sent a note to Finch asking him to prepare the formal documentation, removing Greaves from any county filings related to the estate, which Finch confirmed had already been handled the previous week. "Clean," she said when she read his confirmation. "As clean as these things get," Luke said, reading over her shoulder. He was doing that more often, standing behind her when she read correspondence at the desk, close enough that she was aware of him, but not so close that it was intrusive. It was one of the things she had noticed about him, the particular spatial intelligence of a man who had learned to occupy rooms without demanding them. "Which is reasonably clean," she said. "Yes." He straightened. "Ben thinks we'll need to replace the windmill on the east field before summer. The mechanism is wearing." She made a note. The cost of a new windmill mechanism went on the maintenance list beside the north pasture shelter and the east barn roof repairs that were already scheduled. She added them up in her head and set them against the summer market projections and found the balance tenable, assuming the market came in close to the revised estimate. "How much confidence do you have in the summer estimate?" Luke asked. "Moderate," she said. "The spring count is low but not disastrous. The quality of the herd is good. If the market holds—" She paused. "It's always if the market holds. That's the business." "That's always been the business," she agreed. Luke pulled up a chair to the desk beside her, something he had started doing in the last few weeks, settling in as though he were simply going to sit there and work alongside her, which was essentially what he was doing. He took the current ledger and began reviewing the monthly figures she had been preparing to transcribe. And she watched him for a moment, the focused attention he brought to the numbers, the way he read them not as an exercise, but as a story, which was the way good ranch managers always read ledgers. And then she went back to her own work. They worked together in the study for 2 hours that afternoon without needing to say very much, and the work went. The way work goes when two people understand each other's rhythms well enough to share a workspace without interference, which was, Eleanor had always thought, one of the better tests of a working relationship. When the afternoon light had shifted enough that she needed to move the lamp, she moved it, and the lamplight fell across the desk and across Luke's hands on the ledger pages and across the various documents and correspondence and filings that together constituted the current chapter of Blackstone Ranch, and she looked at it, all the work and the record of the work and the person beside her working, and she felt the particular satisfaction that had been building slowly all spring towards something she did not yet have a complete word for, but thought she might in time find one. Habam! The summer moved forward the way Montana summers move, fast, bright, with a kind of urgent beauty that you only fully register if you've lived through enough winters to understand how briefly it lasts. The hay grew tall in the east meadow and came in well. The cattle grazed deep into the south pastures. The creek ran clear from the mountains through the Blackstone north boundary, through land that was now unambiguously Blackstone land, and the sound of it on hot afternoons was the particular sound of a thing that has found its proper course. Caroline stayed through July. She had extended her visit without explanation, and Eleanor did not ask for one, but she noticed that Caroline spent considerable time in the mornings at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea, looking out the window at the pastures, and that she asked questions about the ranch's history that were not strategic questions, not the kind you ask to establish position or assess liability, but the kind you ask when you're trying to understand something you realize you missed. "Tell me about the 1881 water dispute," she said one morning. "The Delaney one, the one Father said he'd sorted out." "I told him it had sorted itself," Eleanor said without looking up from the bread she was forming, which was accurate in the broad sense. "Tell me the actual story." Eleanor considered the bread for a moment. Then she told her Jim Delaney, the rancher to the east, had built a small dam that diverted the secondary creek channel, the one that fed the east pasture's stock pond, onto his own property. Henry had known about it and had been working up to a confrontation with Delaney for 3 months. Eleanor had, in those 3 months, established through the housemaid's network, Pearl's brother worked for Delaney's wife's family, that Delaney was in debt to the Harlan's Fork Bank for a sum he was struggling to manage. She had arranged through an intermediary to quietly purchase that debt from the bank and had then approached Delaney directly without mentioning Henry or Blackstone Ranch at all to discuss a possible refinancing arrangement at more favorable terms, contingent on a small adjustment to the creek channel configuration. Delaney had agreed Henry had never known, and the creek had run correctly ever since. Caroline listened to this with the focused attention she brought to anything that genuinely interested her. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You essentially ousted him from his position without him knowing it." "I helped him out of the difficulty," Eleanor said in a way that also resolved our difficulty. Both things were true. "But you did it without Henry's knowledge." "Henry would have challenged Delaney directly," Eleanor said. "A challenge between two ranchers over water rights in 1881 had a probability of ending in court or worse. I had a cleaner option." "A cleaner option," Caroline repeated. She looked at her tea. "Father thought he solved it." "Your father solved a great many things," Eleanor said. "The credit was always his. That was the appropriate arrangement." Caroline looked at her directly. "That is not the appropriate arrangement," she said. "It's the arrangement you accepted because the alternative was a conflict you weren't positioned to win. That's different." Eleanor stopped working the bread. She looked at Caroline across the kitchen with the particular attention she gave to people when they said something that required recalibrating. "You're not wrong," she said. "I know," Caroline said, "and I want you to know that I know." She picked up her teacup. "Luke and I have been talking about the ranch organization going forward. We think—" She paused. "We think the advisory arrangement Richard proposed is insufficient. We'd like to formalize your authority in writing in a way that's separate from the will proceedings, a partnership document." Eleanor was quiet. "You'd continue managing operations," Caroline said, "but formally, not as the person who manages things because no one else is available to manage them, but as the person who manages things because she is the appropriate person to manage them." She paused. "With appropriate compensation documented properly. Not a percentage of profits, a salary commensurate with a ranch manager of your experience. The 40% provision, you keep the 40%, Caroline said. This would be separate. A formal management salary." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "You mortgaged your inheritance to keep this ranch alive. You spent 30 years making decisions that kept this property viable and let this family continue to believe it was doing well on its own merits. We owe you a great deal more than the provisions of Father's will, and we're aware of that. We're trying to address it in the limited ways available to us." Eleanor set the bread aside. She realized somewhat at a loss, not at the proposal itself, which was sound and reasonable, but at the experience of sitting in the kitchen she had managed for 30 years, and being offered something that she had not asked for, not angled for, not worked to arrange, simply because the people offering it had looked at the facts and decided it was right. "Luke suggested this," she said. "We both did," Caroline said. "Richard agreed, which surprised both of us." "Richard surprised me also," Eleanor said, "in several ways this summer." "He's always been better than his worst self," Caroline said. "Father knew that. I think Father managed him a little like you manage the ranch, gave him enough authority to feel capable without giving him enough rope to make catastrophic decisions." She paused, and something that might have been in a different woman, wry humor, moved through her expression. "Which is probably why Father trusted your judgment." Eleanor put her hands back on the bread. She worked in silence for a moment. "Let me see the draft," she said. "When you have it ready, I'll want to read it carefully before I agree to any specific terms." "Of course," Caroline said. She picked up her tea and stood up. She paused at the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Price." Eleanor looked up. "You were right earlier," Caroline said. "When I first arrived and you said it was your duty, I thought you meant you had no other choice. But that's not what you meant, was it?" "No," Eleanor said. "It wasn't." Caroline nodded once with the firm and undemonstrative economy that was her version of warmth and left. Cham. Luke came back to the ranch in August from his own place to the south where he had been during the hay harvest, and he brought with him a jar of honey from his own hives and a slightly embarrassed air that Eleanor had come to associate with the particular variety of gift-giving that men do when they're not entirely sure of their standing. She thanked him for the honey and put it on the windowsill beside the dried bunch flowers that were still there, changed out each season, the latest batch a brighter yellow than the winter ones had been. "The South Range," he said over dinner, "when I said I'd take you to see the wildflowers." "I remember," she said. "Would tomorrow work?" She considered the day's obligations. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I'll have the morning accounts done by noon." "Noon then," he said. They rode out the next day in the early afternoon on a day that had the particular quality of good Montana August, warm but not punishing, with a sky so blue it looked like something painted rather than natural. Luke rode the gray gelding. Eleanor rode the bay mare she had used for years, a solid and undemonstrative animal that she had always been fond of. The South Range was below the main ranch pastures beyond a long ridge that sloped down to the creek. Luke took her up the ridge rather than along the creek, and when they came over the top of it, she saw what he had been describing, a south-facing slope that caught the afternoon sun covered in wildflowers, bunch flowers and camas and blue larkspur, and the low yellow flowers she didn't know the name of, but had always liked the ones that grew in tight, low clusters close to the ground. She pulled up the bay mare at the top of the ridge. The view went a long way south across the Blackstone Range to the blue line of the mountains east along the creek to where it bent toward the lower valley north, back toward the ranch building small in the distance, the house a gray square against the green. "Henry used to come up here," Luke said beside her. "In the summers. He'd ride up sometimes in the evenings and just sit." "I know," she said. "He told me about it once." She looked across the view. "I never came up while he was here. It felt like his." "Is it yours now?" She looked at the slope of wildflowers, the deep grass of the south pasture below the mountains at the far edge of the horizon. "It belongs to the ranch," she said, "the way all of this does." "The ranch belongs partly to you," he said. 40%, she said. "More than that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the view, not at her, with his hat shading his eyes from the afternoon sun, and the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his posture told her that he was working up to something he had been working up to for some time. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about staying." "I said I wanted to be here," she said, "that I wanted to see it go on." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I want the same thing." Another pause. "I'm going to be honest with you because you've been consistently honest with me, and it seems wrong to do otherwise." She waited. "I would like to be here specifically," he said. "Not at my place south of town, not at some other arrangement. Here. I've known that since I'm not sure exactly when I knew it." He paused again. "And I understand if you find the idea." He stopped himself. He seemed to realize he was getting tangled and took a different approach. "You told me what home means to you. I would like to be part of whatever that is for you, if there's a way of doing that." Eleanor looked at the mountains. The afternoon light was doing something complicated to the mountains, the kind of light that makes mountains look like the edge of another country. "Somewhere you've never been, but that looks entirely familiar." "There have been people," she said carefully, "who imagined that what I felt for Henry was something it wasn't. The town, the family at first. I want you to understand that it wasn't." "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I know what I feel," she said. "At my age and my position. I'm not confused about it." "I know," he said again, and the simplicity of it, no elaboration, no qualification. Just the flat fact of his certainty was, she thought, the most important thing he'd said yet. She looked at him. He was looking at her now with the open and uncomplicated attention that she had noticed in him from the beginning, the quality that set him apart from other men she'd known, the willingness to simply look at a person and let them be what they were. "I'm 58 years old," she said. "I know how old you are," he said. "I know your history. I know what this ranch has cost you." He paused. "I know what you've built here, and what you've given up, and how much of both you've kept quiet." He looked out at the valley. "I'm not asking you to give anything else up. I'm asking if there's room." She was quiet for a long moment. The wildflowers moved in the slight wind, a wave of color across the slope, yellow and blue and white, and the horses stood with the patient ease of animals that have stopped caring where they are as long as they're standing on good grass. "There's room," she said, "for this, for what this is." He heard what she meant, the care in that phrasing, the precision of it, the refusal to make more of it than she could honestly mean, and he nodded, and he did not push for more. He looked back out at the valley. "Good," he said. They sat on the ridge until the light began to change the quality of afternoon, shifting toward the long gold of early evening, and then they rode back to the ranch side by side, without hurry through the wildflowers and the good summer grass. That time, the September market came in well. The Billings Bank received a payment against the note that left the balance manageable through the following spring. Richard arrived from Billings 2 days before the market, as he had said he would, and he sat in the study with Eleanor and Luke and went through the projected numbers with the particular attention of a man who has recently discovered that he cares about something he thought he didn't. He asked good questions. Eleanor answered them. Caroline came back in October for 2 weeks, and she and Eleanor finalized the management agreement, 3 drafts each, refined the third one right. They signed it in the study on a Tuesday morning. Finch as witness, Luke at the window, and when Eleanor wrote her name on the document, Eleanor Grace Price. Her hand was steady and her signature was clear, and she looked at it for a moment after she set down the pen with the complicated satisfaction of someone who has waited long enough for something that waiting for it feels almost appropriate. The county deed survey, Finch said afterward when they were done. For the record, the house and grounds. I'd like to file the updated ownership documentation before winter. Standard registration. Of course, Eleanor said. I'll need to list the owner of record. Eleanor Price, she said. The deed provision from the will. She paused. Is there a question? No question, Finch said. Just making sure you haven't changed your position. She had not changed her position. She did not intend to change her position. The house was the house. She had said before that she had never cared about it for itself, and that was true, but she had come in the months since February to think of it differently. It was not just a building she occupied in the capacity of caretaker. It was by the specific and considered provision of a man who had known her for 30 years and had chosen this way of saying what he could not otherwise say, the physical record of what she had contributed. It was the ranch's way of saying you were always here, and now it is in the documents and the documents matter. She had been the person who taught Henry Blackstone, a practical and skeptical man, that documents matter. She was not going to put her name off a document because it felt like too much. File it as written, she said. The winter of 1894 was hard the way Montana winters are hard, long and honest and demanding. The ranch went about its work. Eleanor went about hers. Luke, who had spent the autumn moving between his own place and the main ranch, settled by December into an arrangement that was practical. More than anything else, his place was well managed by a good foreman and could run without his constant presence, and the main ranch had more need of him. And this was the reason they both used when explaining it to themselves, and neither of them examined it more carefully than was necessary. The housemaids adjusted. Mrs. Aldridge, who had adjusted to 30 years of other things, adjusted to this also without visible effort. Tillis gave Luke the same plain, practical respect he gave anyone who knew the difference between a calf with bloat and a calf that was merely unhappy, and Luke, who had spent a summer riding fence and working calving and sitting in the foreman's office reading ledgers, had demonstrated that he knew the difference. The bunkhouse men made their own adjustments and were on the whole more straightforwardly accepting than anyone would have expected, because the bunkhouse men had a clarity about competence that the Blackstone family had required somewhat longer to develop. Richard came for Christmas with Constance and the children, and they stayed for 2 weeks, and it was, Eleanor thought, the most functional 2 weeks the Blackstone family had spent in that house in the entirety of her 30 years there. The children were noisy and uncomplicated the way children are when they feel at ease, and Constance, who had always been pleasant in the particular careful way of a woman who has married into a complicated family and developed armor accordingly, was in this Christmas slightly less armored and slightly more herself, which turned out to be someone Eleanor found she liked well enough. On Christmas Eve, Constance came to the kitchen while Eleanor was managing the final preparations for the holiday dinner, and she said, "Can I help?" Eleanor looked at her. It was a genuine offer, she could tell, because Constance was already rolling up her sleeves. "The bread needs shaping," Eleanor said. "Third batch." Constance shaped bread for an hour, working at the kitchen table while Eleanor managed the stove, and they talked not about the will, not about the summer's legal proceedings, not about anything complicated about bread mostly, and then about Constance's eldest daughter, who was showing an aptitude for mathematics, and then about nothing in particular. The comfortable, inconsequential nothing of two women working companionably in a warm kitchen on a winter evening. Caroline arrived the day after Christmas and brought with her a friend from Helena, a woman named Margaret Cross, who wrote for the Helena Independent Record, and who looked at Eleanor with the frank professional attention of someone who had heard a version of the story and wanted to understand the full version. Eleanor recognized the look immediately and was not sure at first whether she found it welcome. "I'm told," Margaret said over dinner, that you managed this ranch through several crises without acknowledgement. I managed it with acknowledgement, Eleanor said, just not public acknowledgement. Is that a distinction that matters to you? Eleanor considered the question with her usual attention. The ranch's survival mattered to me, she said. Public acknowledgement was secondary. And now that it's become public, now, Eleanor said, I am glad it is documented correctly. Not for pride, for accuracy. She paused. A ranch is a living record of the people who worked it. The ledgers should tell the true story. Margaret Cross looked at her for a moment, and then she looked at Caroline, and then she looked back at Eleanor and said, May I write about this? Eleanor thought about that. She thought about the versions that had already been circulating in Harlan's Fork and beyond the various inaccurate and partially accurate and completely invented accounts. She thought about the ledgers and the letters and the survey documents and the management agreement, all of which were now filed in various county and territorial offices and constituted together an accurate record. You may write about the ranch, she said, and its history. The ledgers are a matter of public record. She paused. Whether I'm comfortable being the subject of an article is a separate question. What would make you comfortable with it? Margaret said. Eleanor looked across the dinner table at Richard, who was listening with the focused attention he had developed over the summer. At Caroline, who was watching with the strategic alertness she had never lost, but had learned to employ more carefully. At Luke, who was looking at Eleanor with the particular steady warmth that she had grown accustomed to in the way you grow accustomed to the reliable and good things. And she thought about what accuracy meant and what it cost and what it was worth. Write it accurately, she said. No heroism, no villainy, just the facts of what happened and what it took. She picked up her fork. The ranch can speak for itself. Margaret nodded and took out a small notebook from her coat pocket and began to write. Come! The article appeared in the Helena Independent Record in January and was picked up by two smaller papers in eastern Montana and was read among other places in the parlors of Harlan's Fork, where people had been discussing Eleanor Price's situation with considerably more imagination than accuracy for the better part of a year. The article was, as Eleanor had requested, accurate. It was also Margaret Cross being a better writer than Eleanor had initially given her credit for, considerably moving, not in the sentimental way that she had braced herself for, but in the precise way that the best writing moves people by trusting them to be moved by facts. The reaction in Harlan's Fork was mixed, as reactions always are in small towns, but the balance had shifted further than it had in October, and the women from the Methodist Church, not just two this time, came to shake her hand. Patterson at the livery stable was back to looking her in the eye, and had also added to his earlier statement, "Good for you, and it was time someone said so in print." The county clerk, who had been processing her filings all summer, said when she came in with the winter registration, "Mrs. Price, hell of a thing, all of it." She was not entirely certain that was a compliment, but she took it as one. At the general store, the owner's wife, a woman named Gertrude Ennis, who had been one of the first people to cross the street in February, came and found Eleanor in the dry goods aisle and said without preamble, "I owe you an apology." She said it in the plain, direct tone of a woman who has decided to do something and is doing it without ceremony. "I listened to rumors and didn't wait for facts. I was wrong." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. "I hope," Gertrude said, "that you'll come to the church social next month. People would like to see you there." "I'll come," Eleanor said. She meant it. She had been to the church socials for 15 years, in the seat near the back, quietly useful, quietly present. She would go again. The seat near the back was familiar, and familiar was not the same as invisible. And she had always known the difference, even when no one else did. Damasum. The best season in the ranch's recent memory came not in 1894, but in 1895, a full year after Henry's death, when all the decisions that had been made in the difficult months after the funeral had had time to work out in the practical weather of spring and summer. The water from the East Creek branch, now correctly documented as Blackstone property, watered the north pasture without dispute. The Billings note was paid in full in May, with enough reserve to begin the infrastructure repairs the ranch had deferred for 3 years. The east barn roof, the damaged fence sections in the lower pasture, the bunkhouse improvements that Tillis had been requesting since 1892. The cattle count at the summer market was the highest in 11 years. Eleanor recorded it in the ledger in clean, careful lines, and she closed the ledger and she went out to the porch. It was late afternoon, the kind of late afternoon in July that doesn't hurry. The light came across the south pasture in long horizontal lines, gold on the grass, catching the fence posts, making the horses in the lower field look like they'd been hammered out of copper. The mountains were that particular blue that Montana mountains get in midsummer, deep and layered. The snow line shrunk back toward the peaks, but still there, still keeping the creeks running. She stood on the porch with her hands on the rail and looked at it. She had looked at this view thousands of times. She had looked at it in February, with the snow deep on the south pasture and the mountains invisible behind cloud. She had looked at it in mud season and in the first green of May and in the scorched brown of hard August. She had looked at it on the mornings after the difficult nights and on the quiet evenings after the days when everything had worked. She was looking at it now. Behind her, she heard the screen door and Luke's step on the porch boards. She knew his step by now the way she had known Henry's step, the way, the sounds of the place you live. And he came to stand beside her at the rail. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The horses moved below, slow and easy in the afternoon heat, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and somewhere in the pasture a meadowlark was performing with the particular sustained enthusiasm of meadowlarks in summer. And the light went on, doing what good Montana light does with the hours before sunset. "Richard confirmed he's coming in August," Luke said eventually, "for the second market." "I got his letter," she said. "Caroline is coming too. She's bringing Margaret Cross again." Another article. "I believe Margaret is writing something longer. A series, possibly." She paused. "I told her she could review the ledgers." Luke looked at her. "All of them, the relevant ones, from the 60s and 70s. She kept her eyes on the pasture. "It's part of the ranch's history. It should be in the record." He was quiet for a moment. She felt, rather than saw, the slight shift of him, his weight settling against the rail, his attention moving from the pasture to her and then back again. "You used to hate this," he said. "People knowing." "I never hated people knowing," she said. "I hated people knowing things incorrectly." She paused. "The version that was circulating in February was not a version I could accept. The accurate version is one I can live with." She looked at the mountains. "Henry put it in writing. The documents are correct. That's what matters." Luke nodded slowly. "For the record," he said. "For the record," she agreed. He put his hand over hers on the rail. It was a simple thing. His hand over hers, warm from the afternoon, the roughness of outdoor work in his palm, and she looked down at it for a moment, and then she looked back at the pasture, and she turned her hand so that her fingers closed around his, and they stood like that while the light continued to change in its patient and unhurried way across the Blackstone land. The meadowlark kept at it. The horses grazed. The mountains held their blue. There was a word Eleanor thought for this. Not happiness exactly, though it wasn't far from happiness. Not peace exactly, though it was in the same general country. It was the particular state that comes when the thing you have been building carefully and in the partial dark for a very long time finally shows itself in full light, and it is what you thought it was, or something better, and you are still there to see it. She had been there the whole time. She was here now. The light moved on. Across the south pasture, the shadows of the fence posts stretched long and dark toward the east, and the creek made its sound, and the ranch went on in the way of things that are built to last.